Part 2, Chapter 14 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter 14, Outlandish Night. Soames doggedly let the spring come. No easy task for one conscious that time was flying, his birds in the bush no nearer the hand, no issue from the web anywhere visible. Mr. Polteed reported nothing except that his watch went on, costing a lot of money. Val and his cousin were gone to the war, whence came news more favourable. Dartie was behaving himself so far. James had retained his health. Business prospered almost terribly. There was nothing to worry Soames, except that he was held up, could make no step in any direction. He did not exactly avoid Soho, for he could not afford to let them think that he had "piped off," as James would have put it. He might want to "pipe on" again at any minute. But he had to be so restrained and cautious that he would often pass the door of the Restaurant Bretagne without going in, and wander out of the purlieus of that region which always gave him the feeling of having been possessively irregular. He wandered thus one May night into Regent Street, and the most amazing crowd he had ever seen, a shrieking, whistling, dancing, jostling, grotesque and formidably jovial crowd, with false noses and mouth organs, penny whistles and long feathers, every appanage of idiocy, as it seemed to him. Mafeking, of course, it had been relieved. Good. But was that an excuse? Who were these people? What were they? Where had they come from into the West End? His face was tickled, his ears whistled into. Girls cried, "Keep your head on, stucco!" A youth so knocked off his top hat that he recovered it with difficulty. Crackers were exploding beneath his nose, between his feet. He was bewildered, exasperated, offended. This stream of people came from every quarter, as if impulse had unlocked floodgates, let flow waters of whose existence he had heard perhaps, but believed in never. This, then, was the populace, the innumerable living negation of gentility and Forsyteism. This was, egad, democracy. It stank, yelled, was hideous. In the East End, or even Soho, perhaps, but here, in Regent Street, in Piccadilly, what were the police about? In 1900, Soames, with his Forsyte thousands, had never seen the cauldron with the lid off, and now, looking into it, could hardly believe his scorching eyes. The whole thing was unspeakable. These people had no restraint. They seemed to think him funny, such swarms of them, rude, coarse, laughing. And what laughter! Nothing sacred to them. He shouldn't be surprised if they began to break windows. In Pall Mall, past those august dwellings to enter which people paid £60, this shrieking, whistling, dancing dervish of a crowd was swarming. From the club windows his own kind were looking out on them with regulated amusement. They didn't realise. Why, this was serious, might come to anything. The crowd was cheerful, but some day they would come in different mood. He remembered there had been a mob in the late 80s, when he was at Brighton. They had smashed things and made speeches. But more than dread, he felt a deep surprise. They were hysterical. It wasn't English. And all about the relief of a little town as big as Watford, 6,000 miles away. Restraint, reserve, those qualities to him more dear almost than life, those indispensable attributes of property and culture, where were they? It wasn't English. No, it wasn't English. So Soames brooded, threading his way on. It was as if he had suddenly caught sight of someone cutting the covenant for quiet possession out of his legal documents, or of a monster lurking and stalking out in the future, casting its shadow before. Their want of stolidity, their want of reverence. It was like discovering that 9/10 of the people of England were foreigners. And if that were so, then anything might happen. At Hyde Park Corner he ran into George Forsyte, very sunburnt from racing, holding a false nose in his hand. "Hello, Soames," he said. "Have a nose." Soames responded with a pale smile. "Got this from one of those sportsmen," went on George, who had evidently been dining. "Had to lay him out for trying to bash my hat. I say, one of these days we shall have to fight these chaps. They're getting so damned cheeky. All radicals and socialists. They want our goods. You tell Uncle James that. It'll make him sleep." In vino veritas, thought Soames, but he only nodded and passed on up Hamilton Place. There was but a trickle of roisterers in Park Lane, not very noisy. And looking up at the houses, he thought, after all, we're the backbone of the country. This won't upset us easily. Possession's 9 points of the law. But as he closed the door of his father's house behind him, all that queer outlandish nightmare in the streets passed out of his mind almost as completely as if, having dreamt it, he had awakened in the warm, clean morning comfort of his spring mattress bed. Walking into the centre of the great empty drawing-room, he stood still. A wife! Somebody to talk things over with. One had a right, damn it, one had a right. End of Part 2, Chapter 14. Part 3, Chapter 1 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga 2. In Chancery by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 1. Soames in Paris. Soames had travelled little. Aged 19, he had made the Petit tour with his father, mother, and Winifred, Brussels, the Rhine, Switzerland, and home by way of Paris. Aged 27, just when he began to take an interest in pictures, he had spent 5 hot weeks in Italy, looking into the Renaissance, not so much in it as he had been led to expect, and a fortnight in Paris on his way back, looking into himself, as became a Forsyte surrounded by people so strongly self-centred and foreign as the French. His knowledge of their language being derived from his public school, he did not understand them when they spoke. Silence he had found better for all parties. One did not make a fool of oneself. He had disliked the look of the men's clothes, the closed-in cabs, the theatres which looked like beehives, the galleries which smelt of beeswax. He was too cautious and too shy to explore that side of Paris supposed by Forsytes to constitute its attraction under the rose. And as for a collector's bargain, not one to be had. As Nicholas might have put it, they were a grasping lot. He had come back uneasy, saying Paris was overrated. When, therefore, in June of 1900 he went to Paris, it was but his third attempt on the centre of civilization. This time, however, the mountain was going to Mahomet, for he felt by now more deeply civilized than Paris, and perhaps he really was. Moreover, he had a definite objective. This was no mere genuflection to a shrine of taste and immorality, but the prosecution of his own legitimate affairs. He went, indeed, because things were getting past a joke. The watch went on, and nothing. Jolyon had never returned to Paris, and no one else was suspect. Busy with new and very confidential matters, Soames was realizing more than ever how essential reputation is to a solicitor. But at night and in his leisure moments he was ravaged by the thought that time was always flying and money flowing in, and his own future as much in irons as ever. Since Mafeking night he had become aware that a young fool of a doctor was hanging round Annette. Twice he had come across him, a cheerful young fool, not more than 30. Nothing annoyed Soames so much as cheerfulness, an indecent, extravagant sort of quality which had no relation to facts. The mixture of his desires and hopes was, in a word, becoming torture, and lately the thought had come to him that perhaps Irene knew she was being shadowed. It was this which finally decided him to go and see for himself, to go and once more try to break down her repugnance, her refusal to make her own and his path comparatively smooth once more. If he failed again, well, he would see what she did with herself anyway. He went to an hotel in the Rue Caumartin, highly recommended to Forsytes, where practically nobody spoke French. He had formed no plan, he did not want to startle her, yet must contrive that she had no chance to evade him by flight. And next morning he set out in bright weather. Paris had an air of gaiety, a sparkle over its star shape, which almost annoyed Soames. He stepped gravely, his nose lifted a little sideways in real curiosity. He desired now to understand things French. Was not Annette French? There was much to be got out of his visit, if he could only get it. In this laudable mood and the Place de la Concorde he was nearly run down 3 times. He came on the Cours la Reine, where Irene's hotel was situated, almost too suddenly, for he had not yet fixed on his procedure. Crossing over to the riverside, he noted the building, white and cheerful-looking, with green sun-blinds, seen through a screen of plane-tree leaves, and, conscious that it would be far better to meet her casually in some open place than to risk a call, he sat down on a bench, whence he could watch the entrance. It was not quite 11 o'clock, and improbable that she had yet gone out. Some pigeons were strutting and preening their feathers in the pools of sunlight between the shadows of the plane trees. A workman in a blue blouse passed, and threw them crumbs from the paper which contained his dinner. A bonne, coiffed with ribbon, shepherded 2 little girls with pigtails and frilled drawers. A cab meandered by, whose cocher wore a blue coat and a black glazed hat. To Soames a kind of affectation seemed to cling about it all, a sort of picturesqueness which was out of date. A theatrical people, the French. He lit one of his rare cigarettes, with a sense of injury that fate should be casting his life into outlandish waters. He shouldn't wonder if Irene quite enjoyed this foreign life. She had never been properly English, even to look at. And he began considering which of those windows could be hers under the green sun-blinds. How could he word what he had come to say, so that it might pierce the defence of her proud obstinacy? He threw the fag end of his cigarette at a pigeon, with the thought, "I can't stay here for ever twiddling my thumbs. Better give it up and call on her in the late afternoon." But he still sat on, heard 12 strike, and then 1:30. "I'll wait till 1, he thought, while I'm about it." But just then he started up, and shrinkingly sat down again. A woman had come out in a cream-coloured frock, and was moving away under a fawn-covered parasol. Irene herself. He waited till she was too far away to recognise him, then set out after her. She was strolling as though she had no particular objective, moving, if he remembered rightly, towards the Bois de Boulogne. For half an hour at least he kept his distance on the far side of the way, till she had passed into the Bois itself. Was she going to meet someone after all? Some confounded Frenchman, one of those bel ami chaps, perhaps, who had nothing to do but hang about women? For he had read that book with difficulty and a sort of disgusted fascination. He followed doggedly along a shady alley, losing sight of her now and then when the path curved. And it came back to him how, long ago, one night in Hyde Park, he had slid and sneaked from tree to tree, from seat to seat, hunting blindly, ridiculously, in burning jealousy for her and young Bosinney. The path bent sharply, and hurrying, he came on her sitting in front of a small fountain, a little green bronze Niobe, veiled in hair to her slender hips, gazing at the pool she had wept. He came on her so suddenly that he was past before he could turn and take off his hat. She did not start up. She had always had great self-command. It was one of the things he most admired in her, one of his greatest grievances against her, because he had never been able to tell what she was thinking. Had she realized that he was following? Her self-possession made him angry, and disdaining to explain his presence, he pointed to the mournful little Niobe and said, "That's rather a good thing."
He could see then that she was struggling to preserve her composure. "I didn't want to startle you. Is this one of your haunts?" "Yes." "A little lonely?" As he spoke, a lady strolling by paused to look at the fountain and passed on. Irene's eyes followed her. "No," she said, prodding the ground with her parasol. "Never lonely. One has always one's shadow." Soames understood, and looking at her hard, he exclaimed: "Well, it's your own fault. You can be free of it at any moment. Irene, come back to me and be free." Irene laughed. "Don't!" cried Soames, stamping his foot. "It's inhuman. Listen, is there any condition I can make which will bring you back to me? If I promise you a separate house and just a visit now and then?" Irene rose, something wild suddenly in her face and figure. "None, none, none! You may hunt me to the grave. I will not come." Outraged and on edge, Soames recoiled. "Don't make a scene," he said sharply, and they both stood motionless, staring at the little Niobe, whose greenish flesh the sunlight was burnishing. "That's your last word, then," muttered Soames, clenching his hands. "You condemn us both." Irene bent her head. "I can't come back. Good-bye." A feeling of monstrous injustice flared up in Soames. "Stop," he said, "and listen to me a moment. You gave me a sacred vow. You came to me without a penny. You had all I could give. You broke that vow without cause. You made me a byword. You refused me a child. You've left me in prison. You still move me so that I want you. I want you. Well, what do you think of yourself?" Irene turned. Her face was deadly pale, her eyes burning dark. "God made me as I am," she said, "wicked if you like, but not so wicked that I'll give myself again to a man I hate." The sunlight gleamed on her hair as she moved away, and seemed to lay a caress all down her clinging cream-coloured frock. Soames could neither speak nor move. That word, hate, so extreme, so primitive, made all the Forsyte in him tremble. With a deep imprecation he strode away from where she had vanished, and ran almost into the arms of the lady sauntering back. The fool, the shadowing fool! He was soon dripping with perspiration in the depths of the Bois. "Well," he thought, "I need have no consideration for her now. She hasn't got a grain of it for me. I'll show her this very day that she's my wife still." But on the way back to his hotel he was forced to the conclusion that he did not know what he meant. One could not make scenes in public, and short of scenes in public, what was there he could do? He almost cursed his own thin-skinnedness. She might deserve no consideration, but he, alas, deserved some at his own hands. And sitting lunchless in the hall of his hotel, with tourists passing every moment, Baedeker in hand, he was visited by black dejection. In irons. His whole life, with every natural instinct and every decent yearning gagged and fettered, and all because fate had driven him 17 years ago to set his heart upon this woman, so utterly that even now he had no real heart to set on any other. Cursed was the day he had met her, and his eyes for seeing in her anything but the cruel Venus she was. And yet, still seeing her with the sunlight on the clinging china crepe of her gown, he uttered a little groan, so that a tourist who was passing thought, "Man in pain. Let's see, what did I have for lunch?" Later, in front of a café near the opera, over a glass of cold tea with lemon and a straw in it, he took the malicious resolution to go and dine at her hotel. If she were there he would speak to her. If she were not, he would leave a note. He dressed carefully and wrote as follows: "Your idyll with that fellow Jolyon Forsyte is known to me at all events. If you pursue it, understand that I will leave no stone unturned to make things unbearable for him. S.F." He sealed this note, but did not address it, refusing to write the maiden name which she had impudently resumed, or to put the word Forsyte on the envelope, lest she should tear it up unread. Then he went out and made his way through the glowing streets, abandoned to evening pleasure seekers. Entering her hotel, He took his seat in a far corner of the dining-room, whence he could see all entrances and exits. She was not there. He ate little, quickly, watchfully. She did not come. He lingered in the lounge over his coffee, drank 2 liqueurs of brandy, but still she did not come. He went over to the keyboard and examined the names. Number 12 on the first floor, and he determined to take the note up himself. He mounted red-carpeted stairs, past a little salon. 8, 10, 12. Should he knock, push the note under, or... He looked furtively round and turned the handle. The door opened, but into a little space leading to another door. He knocked on that. No answer. The door was locked. It fitted very closely to the floor.
The note would not go under.
He thrust it back into his pocket and stood a moment listening. He felt somehow certain that she was not there. And suddenly he came away, passing the little salon down the stairs. He stopped at the bureau and said, "Will you kindly see that Mrs. Heron has this note?" "Madame Heron left today, monsieur, suddenly, about 3 o'clock. There was illness in her family." Soames compressed his lips. "Oh," he said. "Do you know her address?" "No, monsieur. England, I think." Soames put the note back into his pocket and went out. He hailed an open horse-cab which was passing. "Drive me anywhere." The man, who obviously did not understand, smiled and waved his whip, and Soames was borne along in that little yellow-wheeled victoria, all over star-shaped Paris, with here and there a pause, and the question, "C'est par ici, monsieur?" "No, go on," till the man gave it up in despair, and the yellow-wheeled chariot continued to roll between the tall, flat-fronted, shuttered houses and plane-tree avenues, a little Flying Dutchman of a cab. Like my life, thought Soames, without object, on and on. End of Part 3, Chapter 1.
Part 3, Chapter 2 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida. The Forsyte Saga, Volume 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 2. In the Web. Soames returned to England the following day, and on the third morning received a visit from Mr. Polteed, who wore a flower and carried a brown billycock hat. Soames motioned him to a seat. "The news from the war is not so bad, is it?" said Mr. Polteed. "I hope I see you well, sir." "Thanks, quite." Mr. Polteed leaned forward, smiled, opened his hand, looked into it, and said softly, "I think we have done your business for you at last." "What?" ejaculated Soames. 19 reports quite suddenly what I think we shall be justified in calling conclusive evidence." And Mr. Polteed paused. "Well?" "On the 10th instant, after witnessing an interview between 17 and a party earlier in the day, 19 can swear to having seen him coming out of her bedroom in the hotel about 10 o'clock in the evening. With a little care in the giving of the evidence, that will be enough, especially as 17 has left Paris, no doubt with the party in question. In fact, they both slipped off, and we have not got on to them again yet. But we shall. She has worked hard under very difficult circumstances, and I'm glad she brought it off at last." Mr. Polteed took out a cigarette, tapped its end against the table, looked at Soames and put it back. The expression on his client's face was not encouraging. "Who is this new person?" said Soames abruptly. "That we don't know. She will swear to the fact, and she has got his appearance pat." Mr. Polteed took out a letter and began reading. "Middle-aged, medium height, blue dittos in afternoon, evening dress at night, pale dark hair, small dark moustache, flat cheeks, good chin, grey eyes, small feet, guilty look." Soames rose and went to the window. He stood there in sardonic fury. Congenital idiot, spidery congenital idiot. 7 months at £15 a week, to be tracked down as his own wife's lover. Guilty look. He threw the window open. "It is hot," he said, and came back to his seat. Crossing his knees, he bent a supercilious glance on Mr. Polteed. "I doubt if that is quite good enough," he said, drawling the words, "with no name or address. I think you may let that lady have a rest, and take up our friend 47 at this end." Whether Polteed had spotted him he could not tell, but he had a mental vision of him in the midst of his cronies dissolved in indistinguishable laughter. "Guilty look, damnation!" Mr. Polteed said in a tone of urgency, almost of pathos, "I assure you, we have put it through sometimes on less than that. It is Paris, you know. Attractive woman living alone. Why not risk it, sir? We might screw it up a peg." Soames had sudden insight. The fellow's professional zeal was stirred. "Greatest triumph of my career. Got a man his divorce through a visit to his own wife's bedroom. Something to talk of there, when I retire." And for one wild moment he thought, why not? After all, hundreds of men of medium height had small feet and a guilty look. "I am not authorized to take any risk," he said shortly. Mr. Polteed looked up. "Pity," he said, "quite a pity. That other affair seemed very costive." Soames rose. "Never mind that. Please watch 47, and take care not to find a mare's nest. Good morning." Mr. Polteed's eye glinted at the words "mare's nest." "Very good. You shall be kept informed." And Soames was alone again. The spidery, dirty, ridiculous business. Laying his arms on the table, he leaned his forehead on them. Full 10 minutes he rested thus, till a managing clerk roused him with the draft prospectus of a new issue of shares, very desirable, in manifold and toppings. That afternoon he left work early and made his way to the restaurant Bretagne. Only Madame Lamotte was in. Would Monsieur have tea with her? Soames bowed. When they were seated at right angles to each other in the little room, he said abruptly, "I want to talk with you, madame." The quick lift of her clear brown eyes told him that she had long expected such words. "I have to ask you something first. That young doctor, what's his name? Is there anything between him and Annette?" Her whole personality had become, as it were, like jet, clear-cut, black, hard, shining. "Annette is young," she said. "So is Monsieur le Docteur. Between young people things move quickly. But Annette is a good daughter. Ah, what a jewel of a nature!" The least little smile twisted Soames's lips. "Nothing definite, then?" "But definite? No, indeed. The young man is very nice, but what would you? There is no money at present." She raised her willow pattern teacup. Soames did the same. Their eyes met. "I am a married man," he said, "living apart from my wife for many years. I am seeking to divorce her." Madame Lamotte put down her cup. Indeed, what tragic things there were! The entire absence of sentiment in her inspired a queer species of contempt in Soames. "I am a rich man," he added, fully conscious that the remark was not in good taste. "It is useless to say more at present, but I think you understand." Madame's eyes, so open that the whites showed above them, looked at him very straight. "Ah, ça, mais nous avons le temps," was all she said. "Another little cup?" Soames refused, and taking his leave, walked westward. He had got that off his mind. She would not let Annette commit herself with the cheerful young ass until— But what chance of his ever being able to say, "I am free"? What chance? The future had lost all semblance of reality. He felt like a fly entangled in cobweb filaments, watching the desirable freedom of the air with pitiful eyes. He was short of exercise, and wandered on to Kensington Gardens and down Queen's Gate towards Chelsea. Perhaps she had gone back to her flat. That, at all events, he could find out. For since that last and most ignominious repulse, his wounded self-respect had taken refuge again in the feeling that she must have a lover. He arrived before the little mansions at the dinner hour. No need to inquire. A grey-haired lady was watering the flower boxes in her window. It was evidently let. And he walked slowly past again, along the river, an evening of clear, quiet beauty, all harmony and comfort, except within his heart. End of Part 3, Chapter 2. Recording by Eva Harnick, Pontevedra, Florida. Chapter 3 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick, Pontevedra, Florida. The Forsyte Saga, Volume 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 3, Richmond Park. On the afternoon that Soames crossed to France, a cablegram was received by Jolyon at Robin Hill. "Your son down with enteric. No immediate danger. Will cable again." It reached the household already agitated by the imminent departure of June, whose berth was booked for the following day. She was indeed in the act of confiding Eric Cobley and his family to her father's care when the message arrived. The resolution to become a Red Cross nurse, taken under stimulus of Jolly's enlistment, had been loyally fulfilled with the irritation and regret which all Forsytes feel at what curtails their individual liberties. Enthusiastic at first about the wonderfulness of the work, She had begun after a month to feel that she could train herself so much better than others could train her. And if Holly had not insisted on following her example and being trained too, she must inevitably have cried off. The departure of Jolly and Val with their troop in April had further stiffened her failing resolve. But now, on the point of departure, the thought of leaving Eric Cobley with a wife and 2 children adrift in the cold waters of an unappreciative world weighed on her so that she was still in danger of backing out. The reading of that cablegram, with its disquieting reality, clinched the matter. She saw herself already nursing Jolly, for of course they would let her nurse her own brother. Jolyon, ever wide and doubtful, had no such hope. Poor June! Could any Forsyte of her generation grasp how rude and brutal life was? Ever since he knew of his boy's arrival at Cape Town, the thought of him had been a kind of recurrent sickness in Jolyon. He could not get reconciled to the feeling that Jolly was in danger all the time. The cablegram, grave though it was almost a relief. He was now safe from bullets, anyway. And yet this enteric was a virulent disease. The Times was full of deaths therefrom. Why could he not be lying out there in that up-country hospital, and his boy safe at home? The unforsytean self-sacrifice of his 3 children, indeed, had quite bewildered Jolyon. He would eagerly change places with Jolly because he loved his boy, but no such personal motive was influencing them. He could only think that it marked the decline of the Forsyte type. Late that afternoon Holly came out to him under the old oak tree. She had grown up very much during these last months of hospital training, away from home. And seeing her approach, he thought, she has more sense than June. Child though she is, more wisdom. Thank God she isn't going out. She had seated herself in the swing, very silent and still. She feels this, thought Jolyon, as much as I. And seeing her eyes fixed on him, he said, "Don't take it to heart too much, my child. If he weren't ill, he might be in much greater danger." Holly got out of the swing. "I want to tell you something, Dad. It was through me that Jolly enlisted and went out." "How's that?" "When you were away in Paris, Val Dartie and I fell in love. We used to ride in Richmond Park. We got engaged. Jolly found it out and thought he ought to stop it. So he dared Val to enlist. It was all my fault, Dad. And I want to go out too, because if anything happens to either of them, I should feel awful. Besides, I am just as much trained as June." Jolyon gazed at her in a stupefaction that was tinged with irony. So this was the answer to the riddle he had been asking himself. And his 3 children were Forsytes after all. Surely Holly might have told him all this before. But he smothered the sarcastic sayings on his lips. Tenderness to the young was perhaps the most sacred article of his belief. He had got no doubt what he deserved. Engaged! So this was why he had so lost touch with her. And to young Val Dartie, nephew of Soames, in the other camp. It was all terribly distasteful. He closed his easel and set his drawing against the tree. "Have you told June?" "Yes. She says she will get me into her cabin somehow. It is a single cabin, but one of us could sleep on the floor. If you consent, she will go up now and get permission." Consent, thought Jolyon. Rather late in the day to ask for that. But again he checked himself. "You are too young, my dear. They won't let you. June knows some people that she helped to go to Cape Town. If they won't let me nurse yet, I could stay with them and go on training there. Let me go, Dad." Jolyon smiled because he could have cried. "I never stop anyone from doing anything," he said. Holly flung her arms round his neck. "Oh, Dad, you are the best in the world." That means the worst, thought Jolyon. If he had ever doubted his creed of tolerance, he did so then. "I am not friendly with Val's family," he said, "and I don't know Val, but Jolly did not like him." Holly looked at the distance and said, "I love him." "That settles it," said Jolyon dryly, then catching the expression on her face, he kissed her with the thought, "Is anything more pathetic than the face of the young?" Unless he actually forbade her going, it was obvious that he must make the best of it, so he went up to town with June. Whether due to her persistence, or the fact that the official they saw was an old school friend of Jolyon's, they obtained permission for Holly to share the single cabin. He took them to Surbiton Station the following evening, and they duly slid away from him, provided with money, invalid foods, and those letters of credit without which Forsytes do not travel. He drove back to Robin Hill under a brilliant sky to his late dinner, served with an added care by servants trying to show him that they sympathized, eaten with an added scrupulousness to show them that he appreciated their sympathy. But it was a real relief to get to his cigar on the terrace of flagstones, cunningly chosen by young Bosinney for shape and colour, with night closing in around him, so beautiful a night, hardly whispering in the trees, and smelling so sweet that it made him ache. The grass was drenched with dew, and he kept to those flagstones, up and down, till presently it began to seem to him that he was one of three, not wheeling, but turning right about each end, so that his father was always nearest to the house, and his son always nearest to the terrace edge. Each had an arm lightly within his arm. He dared not lift his hand to his cigar, lest he should disturb them, and it burned away, dripping ash on him till it dropped from his lips at last, which were getting hot. They left him then, and his arms felt chilly. 3 Jolyons in 1 Jolyon they had walked. He stood still, counting the sounds: a carriage passing on the high road, a distant train, the dog at Gage's farm, the whispering trees, the groom playing on his penny whistle. A multitude of stars up there, bright and silent, so far off. No moon as yet. Just enough light to show him the dark flags and swords of the iris flowers along the terrace edge, his favourite flower, that had the night's own colour on its curving, crumpled petals. He turned round to the house. Big, unlighted, not a soul beside himself to live in all that part of it. Stark loneliness. He could not go on living here alone. And yet, so long as there was beauty, why should a man feel lonely? The answer as to some idiot's riddle was, because he did. The greater the beauty, the greater the loneliness. For at the back of beauty was harmony, and at the back of harmony was union. Beauty could not comfort if the soul were out of it. The night, maddeningly lovely, with bloom of grapes on it in starshine, and the breath of grass and honey coming from it, he could not enjoy, while she, who was to him the life of beauty, its embodiment and essence, was cut off from him, utterly cut off now, he felt, by honorable decency. He made a poor fist of sleeping, striving too hard after that resignation which Forsytes find difficult to reach, bred to their own way and left so comfortably off by their fathers. But after dawn he dozed off and soon was dreaming a strange dream. He was on a stage with immensely high rich curtains, high as the very stars, stretching in a semicircle from footlights to footlights. He himself was very small, a little black, restless figure roaming up and down, and the odd thing was that he was not altogether himself, but Soames as well, so that he was not only experiencing but watching. This figure of himself and Soames was trying to find a way out through the curtains, which, heavy and dark, kept him in. Several times he had crossed in front of them, before he saw with delight a sudden narrow rift, a tall chink of beauty, the color of iris flowers, like a glimpse of paradise, remote, ineffable. Stepping quickly forward to pass into it, he found the curtains closing before him. Bitterly disappointed, he, or was it Soames, moved on, and there was the chink again through the parted curtains, which again closed too soon. This went on, and he never got through till he woke with the word Irene on his lips. The dream disturbed him badly, especially that identification of himself with Soames. Next morning, finding it impossible to work, he spent hours riding Jolly's horse in search of fatigue. And on the second day he made up his mind to move to London and see if he could not get permission to follow his daughters to South Africa. He had just begun to pack the following morning when he received this letter. Green Hotel, June 13, Richmond. My dear Jolyon, you will be surprised to see how near I am to you. Paris became impossible, and I have come here to be within reach of your advice. I would so love to see you again. Since you left Paris, I don't think I have met anyone I could really talk to. Is all well with you and with your boy? No one knows, I think, that I am here at present. Always your friend Irene. Irene within 3 miles of him, and again in flight. He stood with a very queer smile on his lips. This was more than he had bargained for. About noon he set out on foot across Richmond Park, and as he went along he thought, Richmond Park, by Jove, it suits us Forsytes. Not that Forsytes lived there, nobody lived there save royalty, rangers, and the deer. But in Richmond Park nature was allowed to go so far and no further, putting up a brave show of being natural, seeming to say, look at my instincts, they are almost passions, very nearly out of hand, but not quite, of course. The very hub of possession is to possess oneself. Yes, Richmond Park possessed itself, even on that bright day of June, with arrowy cuckoos shifting the 3 points of their calls and the wood doves announcing high summer. The Green Hotel, which Jolyon entered at 1 o'clock, stood nearly opposite that more famous hostelry, the Crown and Sceptre. It was modest, highly respectable, never out of cold beef, gooseberry tart, and a dowager or two, so that a carriage and pair was almost always standing before the door. In a room draped in chintz so slippery as to forbid all emotion, Irene was sitting on a piano stool covered with scroll work, playing Hansel and Gretel out of an old score. Above her on a wall, not yet Morris papered, was a print of the Queen on a pony amongst deer-hound Scotch caps and slain stags. Besides her, in a pot on the window-sill, was a white and rosy fuchsia. The Victorianism of the room almost talked, and in her clinging frock Irene seemed to Jolyon like Venus emerging from the shell of the past century. "If the proprietor had eyes," he said, "he would show you the door. You have broken through his decorations." Thus lightly he smothered up an emotional moment. Having eaten cold beef, pickled walnut, gooseberry tart, and drunk stone-bottled ginger beer, they walked into the park, and light talk was succeeded by the silence Jolyon had dreaded. "You haven't told me about Paris," he said at last. "No, I have been shadowed for a long time. One gets used to that. But then Soames came. By the little Niobe, the same story. Would I go back to him? Incredible!" She had spoken without raising her eyes, but she looked up now. Those dark eyes, clinging to his, said as no words could have, "I have come to an end. If you want me, here I am." For sheer emotional intensity had he ever, old as he was, passed through such a moment? The words, "Irene, I adore you," almost escaped him. Then, with a clearness of which he would not have believed mental vision capable, he saw Jolly lying with a white face turned to a white wall. "My boy is very ill out there," he said quietly. Irene slipped her arms through his. "Let us walk on. I understand." No miserable explanation to attempt. She had understood. And they walked on among the bracken, knee-high already, between the rabbit holes and the oak trees, talking of Jolly. He left her 2 hours later at the Richmond Hill gate and turned towards home. "She knows of my feeling for her, then," he thought. Of course, one could not keep knowledge of that from such a woman. End of Part 3, Chapter 3. Richmond Park. Recording by Eva Harnick, Pontevedra, Florida.
Part 3, Chapter 4 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 4. Over the River. Jolly was tired to death of dreams. They had left him now too wan and weak to dream again, left him to lie torpid, faintly remembering far-off things, just able to turn his eyes and gaze through the window near his cot at the trickle of river running by in the sands, at the straggling milk-bush of the karoo beyond. He knew what the karoo was now. even if he had not seen a Boer roll over like a rabbit or heard the whine of flying bullets. This pestilence had sneaked on him before he had smelled powder. A thirsty day and a rash drink, or perhaps a tainted fruit, who knew? Not he, who had not even strength left to grudge the evil thing its victory, just enough to know that there were many lying here with him, that he was sore with frenzied dreaming, just enough to watch that thread of river and be able to remember faintly those far-away things. The sun was nearly down. It would be cooler soon. He would have liked to know the time, to feel his old watch, so butter smooth, to hear the repeater strike. It would have been friendly, homelike. He had not even strength to remember that the old watch was last wound the day he began to lie here. The pulse of his brain beat so feebly that faces which came and went, nurses, doctors, orderlies, were indistinguishable. Just one indifferent face, and the words spoken about him meant all the same thing, and that almost nothing. Those things he used to do, though far and faint, were more distinct. Walking past the foot of the old steps at Harrow Bill. "Here, sir. Here, sir." Rapping boots in the Westminster Gazette. Greenish paper. Shining boots. Grandfather coming from somewhere dark. A smell of earth. The mushroom house. Robin Hill. Burying poor old Balthazar in the leaves. Dad. Home. Consciousness came again, with noticing that the river had no water in it. Someone was speaking too. Want anything? No. What could one want? Too weak to want. Only to hear his watch strike. Holly. She wouldn't bowl properly. Oh, pitch them up. Not sneaks. Back her to and bow. He was too. Consciousness came once more with a sense of the violet dusk outside, and a rising blood-red crescent moon. His eyes rested on it fascinated. In the long minutes of brain nothingness it went moving up and up. "He's going, Doctor." "Not pack boots again? Never? Mind your form too. Don't cry. Go quietly over the river. Sleep. Dark. If somebody would strike his watch." End of Part 3, Chapter 4.
Part 3, Chapter 5 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida. The Forsyte Saga. Volume 2. In Chancery by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 5. Soames Acts. A sealed letter in the handwriting of Mr. Polteed remained unopened in Soames's pocket throughout 2 hours of sustained attention to the affairs of the new colliery company, which, declining almost from the moment of old Jolyon's retirement from the chairmanship, had lately run down so fast that there was now nothing for it but a winding up. He took the letter out to lunch at his city club, sacred to him for the meals he had eaten there with his father in the early 70s, when James used to like him to come and see for himself the nature of his future life. Here in a remote corner, before a plate of roast mutton and mashed potato, he read: "Dear Sir, in accordance with your suggestion, We have duly taken the matter up at the other end with gratifying results. Observation of 47 has enabled us to locate 17 at the Green Hotel, Richmond. The two have been observed to meet daily during the past week in Richmond Park. Nothing absolutely crucial has so far been notified. But in conjunction with what we had from Paris at the beginning of the year, I am confident we could now satisfy the court. We shall, of course, continue to watch the matter until we hear from you. Very faithfully yours, Claude Polteed. Soames read it through twice and beckoned to the waiter. "Take this away, it is cold." "Shall I bring you some more, sir?" "No, get me some coffee in the other room." And, paying for what he had not eaten, he went out, passing two acquaintances without sign of recognition. "Satisfy the court," he thought, sitting at a little round marble table with the coffee before him. "That fellow Jolyon!" He poured out his coffee, sweetened and drank it. He would disgrace him in the eyes of his own children. And, rising with that resolution hot within him, he found for the first time the inconvenience of being his own solicitor. He could not treat this scandalous matter in his own office. He must commit the soul of his private dignity to a stranger, some other professional dealer in family dishonor. Who was there he could go to? Linkman and Lever in Budge Row, perhaps, reliable, not too conspicuous, only nodding acquaintances. But before he saw them, he must see Polteed again. But at this thought Soames had a moment of sheer weakness. To part with his secret, how find the words? How subject himself to contempt and secret laughter? Yet, after all, the fellow knew already. Oh, yes, he knew. And feeling that he must finish with it now, he took a cab into the West End. In this hot weather, the window of Mr. Polteed's room was positively open, and the only precaution was a wire gauze preventing the intrusion of flies. 2 or 3 had tried to come in and been caught, so that they seemed to be clinging there with the intention of being devoured presently. Mr. Polteed, following the direction of his client's eye, rose apologetically and closed the window. "Posing ass," thought Soames. Like all who fundamentally believe in themselves, he was rising to the occasion, and, with his little sideways smile, he said, "I have had your letter. I am going to act. I suppose you know who the lady you have been watching really is?" Mr. Polteed's expression at that moment was a masterpiece. It so clearly said, "Well, what do you think?" But mere professional knowledge, I assure you, pray forgive it. He made a little half-airy movement with his hand, as who should say, such things will happen to us all. "Very well, then," said Soames, moistening his lips. "There is no need to say more. I am instructing Linkman and Lever of Budge Row to act for me. I don't want to hear your evidence, but kindly make your report to them at 5 o'clock, and continue to observe the utmost secrecy." Mr. Polteed half closed his eyes as if to comply at once. "My dear sir," he said. "Are you convinced?" asked Soames with sudden energy, "that there is enough?" The faintest movement occurred to Mr. Polteed's shoulders. "You can risk it," he murmured, With what we have and human nature, you can risk it." Soames rose. "You will ask for Mr. Linkman. Thanks, don't get up." He could not bear Mr. Polteed to slide as usual between him and the door. In the sunlight of Piccadilly he wiped his forehead. This had been the worst of it. He could stand the strangers better. And he went back into the city to do what still lay before him. That evening in Park Lane, watching his father dine, he was overwhelmed by his old longing for a son to watch him eat as he went down the years, to be taken on his knee as James on a time had been wont to take him, a son of his own begetting, who could understand him because he was the same flesh and blood, understand and comfort him, and become more rich and cultured than himself, because he would start even better off. To get old like that thin, grey, wiry, frail figure sitting there, and be quite alone with possessions heaping up around him, to take no interest in anything, because it had no future and must pass away from him to hands and mouths and eyes for whom he cared no jot. No! He would force it through now, and be free to marry and have a son to care for him before he grew to be too like the old man, his father, wistfully watching, now his sweetbread, now his son. In that mood he went up to bed. But lying warm between those fine linen sheets of Emily's providing, he was visited by memories and torture. Visions of Irene, almost the solid feeling of her body beset him. Why had he ever been fool enough to see her again, and let this flood back on him, so that it was pain to think of her with that fellow, that stealing fellow? End of Part 3, Chapter 5, Soames Acts. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida.
Part 3, Chapter 6 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 6, A Summer Day. His boy was seldom absent from Jolyon's mind in the days which followed the first walk with Irene in Richmond Park. No further news had come. Inquiries at the War Office elicited nothing, nor could he expect to hear from June and Holly for 3 weeks at least. In these days he felt how insufficient were his memories of Jolly, and what an amateur of a father he had been. There was not a single memory in which anger played a part, not one reconciliation, because there had never been a rupture, nor one heart-to-heart confidence, not even when Jolly's mother died. Nothing but half-ironical affection. He had been too afraid of committing himself in any direction, for fear of losing his liberty, or interfering with that of his boy. Only in Irene's presence had he relief, highly complicated by the ever-growing perception of how divided he was between her and his son. With Jolly was bound up all that sense of continuity and social creed of which he had drunk deeply in his youth, and again during his boy's public school and varsity life, all that sense of not going back on what father and son expected of each other. With Irene was bound up all his delight in beauty and in nature, and he seemed to know less and less which was the stronger within him. From such sentimental paralysis he was rudely awakened, however, one afternoon, just as he was starting off to Richmond, by a young man with a bicycle and a face oddly familiar, who came forward faintly smiling. "Mr. Jolyon Forsyte? Thank you." Placing an envelope in Jolyon's hand, he wheeled off the path and rode away. Bewildered, Jolyon opened it. "Admiralty, probate and divorce. Forsyte v. Forsyte and Forsyte." A sensation of shame and disgust was followed by the instant reaction, "Why, here's the very thing you want, and you don't like it." But she must have had one too, and he must go to her at once. He turned things over as he went along. It was an ironical business. For whatever the Scriptures said about the heart, it took more than mere longings to satisfy the law. They could perfectly well defend this suit, or at least in good faith try to. But the idea of doing so revolted Jolyon. If not her lover indeed, he was in desire, and he knew that she was ready to come to him. Her face had told him so. Not that he exaggerated her feeling for him. She had had her grand passion, and he could not expect another from her at his age. But she had trust in him, affection for him, and must feel that he would be a refuge. Surely she would not ask him to defend the suit, knowing that he adored her. Thank heaven she had not that maddening British conscientiousness which refused happiness for the sake of refusing. She must rejoice at this chance of being free after 17 years of death in life. As to publicity, the fat was in the fire. To defend the suit would not take away the slur. Jolyon had all the proper feeling of a Forsyte whose privacy is threatened. If he was to be hung by the law, by all means let it be for a sheep. Moreover, the notion of standing in a witness box and swearing to the truth that no gesture, not even a word, of love had passed between them, seemed to him more degrading than to take the tacit stigma of being an adulterer, more truly degrading, considering the feeling in his heart, and just as bad and painful for his children. The thought of explaining away, if he could, before a judge and 12 average Englishmen, their meetings in Paris and the walks in Richmond Park, horrified him. The brutality and hypocritical censoriousness of the whole process, the probability that they would not be believed, the mere vision of her whom he looked on as the embodiment of nature and of beauty, standing there before all those suspicious gloating eyes, was hideous to him. No, no. To defend a suit only made a London holiday and sold the newspapers. 1,000 times better accept what Soames and the gods had sent. Besides, he thought honestly, who knows whether, even for my boy's sake, I could have stood this state of things much longer. Anyway, her neck will be out of Chancery at last. Thus absorbed, he was hardly conscious of the heavy heat. The sky had become overcast, purplish, with little streaks of white. A heavy heat drop plashed a little star pattern in the dust of the road as he entered the park. Phew, he thought. Thunder. I hope she's not come to meet me. There's a ducky up there. But at that very minute he saw Irene coming towards the gate. We must scuttle back to Robin Hill, he thought. The storm had passed over the Poultry at 4 o'clock, bringing welcome distraction to the clerks in every office. Soames was drinking a cup of tea when a note was brought in to him. Dear Sir, Forsyte v. Forsyte and Forsyte. In accordance with your instructions, we beg to inform you that we personally served the respondent and co-respondent in this suit today at Richmond and Robin Hill, respectfully. Faithfully yours, Linkman and Laver. For some minutes Soames stared at that note. Ever since he had given those instructions he had been tempted to annul them. It was so scandalous, such a general disgrace. The evidence, too, what he had heard of it, had never seemed to him conclusive. Somehow he believed less and less that those two had gone all lengths. But this, of course, would drive them to it, and he suffered from the thought. What fellow to have her love where he had failed? Was it too late? Now that they had been brought up sharp by service of this petition, had he not a lever with which he could force them apart? But if I don't act at once, he thought, it will be too late, now they've had this thing. I'll go and see him. I'll go down. And, sick with nervous anxiety, he set out for one of the new-fangled motor cabs. It might take a long time to run that fellow to ground, and goodness knew what decision they might come to after such a shock. If I were a theatrical ass, he thought, I suppose I should be taking a horsewhip or a pistol or something. He took instead a bundle of papers in the case of Magenty versus Wake, intending to read them on the way down. He did not even open them, but sat quite still, jolted and jarred, unconscious of the draught down the back of his neck, or the smell of petrol. He must be guided by the fellow's attitude. The great thing was to keep his head. London had already begun to disgorge its workers as he neared Putney Bridge. The ant-heap was on the move outwards. What a lot of ants, all with a living to get, holding on by their eyelids in the great scramble. Perhaps for the first time in his life Soames thought, I could let go if I liked. Nothing could touch me. I could snap my fingers, live as I wished, enjoy myself. No, one could not live as he had and just drop it all, settle down in Capua to spend the money and reputation he had made. A man's life was what he possessed and sought to possess. Only fools thought otherwise, fools and socialists and libertines. The cab was passing villas now, going a great pace. 50 miles an hour, I should think, he mused. This'll take people out of town to live. And he thought of its bearing on the portions of London owned by his father. He himself had never taken to that form of investment, the gambler in him having all the outlet needed in his pictures. And the cab sped on, down the hill past Wimbledon Common. This interview. Surely a man of 52 with grown-up children and hung on the line would not be reckless. He won't want to disgrace the family, he thought. He was as fond of his father as I am of mine, and they were brothers. That woman brings destruction. What is it in her? I've never known. The cab branched off along the side of a wood, and he heard a late cuckoo calling, almost the first he had heard that year. He was now almost opposite the site he had originally chosen for his house, and which had been so unceremoniously rejected by Bosinney in favour of his own choice. He began passing his handkerchief over his face and hands, taking deep breaths to give him steadiness. Keep one's head, he thought, keep one's head. The cab turned in at the drive which might have been his own, and the sound of music met him. He had forgotten the fellow's daughters. I may be out again directly, he said to the driver, or I may be kept some time. And he rang the bell. Following the maid through the curtains into the inner hall, he felt relieved that the impact of this meeting would be broken by June or Holly, whichever was playing in there, so that with complete surprise he saw Irene at the piano and Jolyon sitting in an armchair, listening. They both stood up. Blood surged into Soames' brain, and all his resolution to be guided by this or that left him utterly. The look of his farmer forebears, dogged Forsytes down by the sea, from superior Dorset back, grinned out of his face. Very pretty, he said. He heard the fellow murmur, This is hardly the place. We'll go to the study, if you don't mind. And they both passed him through the curtain opening. In the little room to which he followed them, Irene stood by the open window, and the fellow close to her by a big chair. Soames pulled the door to behind him with a slam. The sound carried him back all those years to the day when he had shut out Jolyon, shut him out for meddling with his affairs. Well, he said, what have you to say for yourselves? The fellow had the effrontery to smile. What we have received today has taken away your right to ask. I should imagine you will be glad to have your neck out of Chancery. No, said Soames. You think so. I came to tell you that I'll divorce her with every circumstance of disgrace to you both, unless you swear to keep clear of each other from now on. He was astonished at his fluency, because his mind was stammering and his hands twitching. Neither of them answered, but their faces seemed to him as if contemptuous. "Well," he said, "you, Irene?" Her lips moved, but Jolyon laid his hand on her arm. "Let her alone," said Soames furiously. "Irene, will you swear it?" "No." "Oh, and you?" Still less. "So then you're guilty, are you?" "Yes, guilty." It was Irene speaking in that serene voice, with that unreached air which had maddened him so often, and, carried beyond himself, he cried, "You are a devil! Go out, leave this house, or I'll do you an injury." That fellow to talk of injuries! Did he know how near his throat was to being scragged? "A trustee," he said, "embezzling trust property, a thief, stealing his cousin's wife." "Call me what you like. You have chosen your part, we have chosen ours. Go out." If he had brought a weapon, Soames might have used it at that moment. "I'll make you pay," he said. "I should be very happy." At that deadly turning of the meaning of his speech by the son of him who had nicknamed him the man of property, Soames stood glaring. It was ridiculous. There they were, kept from violence by some secret force, no blow possible, no words to meet the case. But he could not, did not know how to turn and go away. His eyes fastened on Irene's face. The last time he would ever see that fatal face, the last time, no doubt. "You," he said suddenly, "I hope you'll treat him as you treated me. That's all." He saw her wince, and with a sensation not quite triumph, not quite relief, he wrenched open the door, passed out through the hall, and got into his cab. He lolled against the cushion with his eyes shut. Never in his life had he been so near to murderous violence, never so thrown away the restraint which was his second nature. He had a stripped and naked feeling, as if all virtue had gone out of him, life meaningless, mind-striking work. Sunlight streamed in on him, but he felt cold. The scene he had passed through had gone from him already. What was before him would not materialize. He could catch on to nothing, and he felt frightened, as if he had been hanging over the edge of a precipice, as if, with another turn of the screw, sanity would have failed him. "I'm not fit for it," he thought. "I mustn't. I'm not fit for it." The cab sped on, and in mechanical procession trees, houses, people passed, but had no significance. "I feel very queer," he thought. "I'll take a Turkish bath. I've been very near to something. It won't do." The cab whirred its way back over the bridge, up the Fulham Road, along the park. "To the Hammam," said Soames. Curious that on so warm a summer day heat should be so comforting. Crossing into the hot room, he met George Forsyte coming out, red and glistening. "Hello," said George. "What are you training for? You've not got much superfluous." "Buffoon!" Soames passed him with his sideways smile. Lying back, rubbing his skin uneasily for the first signs of perspiration, he thought, "Let them laugh. I won't feel anything. I can't stand violence. It's not good for me." End of Part 3, Chapter 6. Recording by Simon Evers.
Part 3, Chapter 7 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 7. A Summer Night. Soames left dead silence in the little study. "Thank you for that good lie," said Jolyon suddenly. "Come out. The air in here is not what it was." In front of a long, high, southerly wall, on which were trained peach trees, the two walked up and down in silence. Old Jolyon had planted some cupressus trees, at intervals, between this grassy terrace and the dipping meadow full of buttercups and ox-eyed daisies. For 12 years they had flourished, till their dark spiral shapes had quite a look of Italy. Birds fluttered softly in the wet shrubbery, the swallows swooped past, with a still blue sheen on their swift little bodies. The grass felt springy beneath the feet, its green refreshed. Butterflies chased each other. After that painful scene, the quiet of nature was wonderfully poignant. Under the sun-soaked wall ran a narrow strip of garden bed full of mignonette and pansies, and from the bees came a low hum in which all other sounds were set: the mooing of a cow deprived of her calf, the calling of a cuckoo from an elm tree at the bottom of the meadow. Who would have thought that behind them, within 10 miles, London began? That London of the Forsytes, with its wealth, its misery, its dirt and noise, its jumbled stone aisles of beauty, its grey sea of hideous brick and stucco. That London which had seen Irene's early tragedy and Jolyon's own hard days. That web, that princely workhouse of the possessive instinct. And while they walked, Jolyon pondered those words. "I hope you'll treat him as you treated me." That would depend on himself. Could he trust himself? Did nature permit a Forsyte not to make a slave of what he adored? Could beauty be confided to him? Or should she not be just a visitor, coming when she would, possessed for moments which passed, to return only at her own choosing? "We are a breed of spoilers," thought Jolyon, "close and greedy. The bloom of life is not safe with us. Let her come to me as she will, when she will, not at all if she will not. Let me be just her stand-by, her perching place, never, never her cage." She was the chink of beauty in his dream. Was he to pass through the curtains now and reach her? Was the rich stuff of many possessions, the close encircling fabric of the possessive instinct walling in that little black figure of himself, and Soames, was it to be rent so that he could pass through into his vision, find there something not of the senses only? Let me, he thought, let me only know how not to grasp and destroy. But at dinner there were plans to be made. Tonight she would go back to the hotel, but tomorrow he would take her up to London. He must instruct his solicitor, Jack Herring. Not a finger must be raised to hinder the process of the law. Damages exemplary, judicial strictures, costs, what they liked. Let it go through at the first moment, so that her neck might be out of Chancery at last. Tomorrow he would see Herring. They would go and see him together. And then, abroad, leaving no doubt, no difficulty about evidence, making the lie she had told into the truth. He looked round at her, and it seemed to his adoring eyes that more than a woman was sitting there. The spirit of universal beauty, deep, mysterious, which the old painters, Titian, Giorgione, Botticelli, had known how to capture and transfer to the faces of their women, this flying beauty seemed to him imprinted on her brow, her hair, her lips, and in her eyes. And this is to be mine, he thought. It frightens me. After dinner they went out on to the terrace to have coffee. They sat there long, the evening was so lovely, watching the summer night come very slowly on. It was still warm, and the air smelled of lime blossom, early this summer. 2 bats were flighting with the faint mysterious little noise they make. He had placed the chairs in front of the study window, and moths flew past to visit the discreet light in there. There was no wind, and not a whisper in the old oak tree 20 yards away. The moon rose from behind the copse, nearly full, and the 2 lights struggled, till moonlight conquered, changing the colour and quality of all the garden, stealing along the flagstones, reaching their feet, climbing up, changing their faces. "Well," said Jolyon at last, "you'll be tired, dear. We'd better start. The maid will show you Holly's room," and he rang the study bell. The maid who came handed him a telegram. Watching her take Irene away, he thought, "This must have come an hour or more ago, and she didn't bring it out to us. That shows. Well, we'll be hung for a sheep soon." And opening the telegram, he read: Jolyon Forsyte, Robin Hill. Your son passed painlessly away on June 20th. Deep sympathy. Some name unknown to him. He dropped it, spun round, stood motionless. The moon shone in on him. A moth flew in his face. The first day of all that he had not thought almost ceaselessly of Jolly. He went blindly towards the window, struck against the old armchair, his father's, and sank down onto the arm of it. He sat there huddled forward, staring into the night. Gone out like a candle flame, far from home, from love, all by himself in the dark. His boy, from a little chap always so good to him, so friendly, 20 years old and cut down like grass, to have no life at all. I didn't really know him, he thought, and he didn't know me, but we loved each other. It's only love that matters. To die out there, lonely, wanting them, wanting home. This seemed to his Forsyte heart more painful, more pitiful than death itself. No shelter, no protection, no love at the last. And all the deeply rooted clanship in him, the family feeling and essential clinging to his own flesh and blood, which had been so strong in old Jolyon, was so strong in all the Forsytes, felt outraged, cut, and torn by his boy's lonely passing. Better far if he had died in battle, without time to long for them to come to him, to call out for them, perhaps, in his delirium. The moon had passed behind the oak tree now, endowing it with uncanny life, so that it seemed watching him. The oak tree his boy had been so fond of climbing, out of which he had once fallen and hurt himself, and hadn't cried. The door creaked. He saw Irene come in, pick up the telegram and read it. He heard the faint rustle of her dress. She sank on her knees close to him, and he forced himself to smile at her. She stretched up her arms and drew his head down on her shoulder. The perfume and warmth of her encircled him. Her presence gained slowly his whole being. End of Part 3, Chapter 7. Recording by Leanne Howlett. Part 3, Chapter 8 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 8. James in Waiting. Sweated to serenity, Soames dined at the Remove and turned his face toward Park Lane. His father had been unwell lately. This would have to be kept from him. Never till that moment had he realised how much the dread of bringing James's grey hairs down with sorrow to the grave had counted with him. How intimately it was bound up with his own shrinking from scandal. His affection for his father, always deep, had increased of late years with the knowledge that James looked on him as the real prop of his decline. It seemed pitiful that one who had been so careful all his life and done so much for the family name, so that it was almost a byword for solid wealthy respectability, should at his last gasp have to see it in all the newspapers. This was like lending a hand to death, that final enemy of Forsytes. I must tell Mother, he thought, and when it comes on, we must keep the papers from him somehow. He sees hardly anyone. Letting himself in with his latchkey, he was beginning to ascend the stairs when he became conscious of commotion on the second-floor landing. His mother's voice was saying, "Now, James, you'll catch cold. Why can't you wait quietly?" His father's answering, "Wait? I'm always waiting. Why doesn't he come in?" You can speak to him tomorrow morning, instead of making a guy of yourself on the landing." "He'll go up to bed, I shouldn't wonder. I shan't sleep." "Now come back to bed, James." I might die before tomorrow morning, for all you can tell." "You shan't have to wait till tomorrow morning. I'll go down and bring him up. Don't fuss." "There you go, always so cock-a-hoop. He mayn't come in at all." "Well, if he doesn't come in, you won't catch him by standing out here in your dressing-gown." Soames rounded the last bend and came in sight of his father's tall figure wrapped in a brown silk-quilted gown, stooping over the balustrade above. Light fell on his silvery hair and whiskers, investing his head with a sort of halo. "Here he is," he heard him say in a voice which sounded injured, and his mother's comfortable answer from the bedroom door. "That's all right. Come in and I'll brush your hair." James extended a thin, crooked finger, oddly like the beckoning of a skeleton, and passed through the doorway of his bedroom. What is it, thought Soames? What has he got hold of now? His father was sitting before the dressing-table, sideways to the mirror, while Emily slowly passed 2 silver-backed brushes through and through his hair. She would do this several times a day, for it had on him something of the effect produced on a cat by scratching between its ears. "There you are," he said. "I've been waiting." Soames stroked his shoulder, and taking up a silver button-hook, examined the mark on it. "Well," he said, "you're looking better." James shook his head. "I want to say something. Your mother hasn't heard." He announced Emily's ignorance of what he hadn't told her, as if it were a grievance. "Your father's been in a great state all the evening. I'm sure I don't know what about." The faint whisk-whisk of the brushes continued the soothing of her voice. "No, you know nothing," said James. "Soames can tell me." And fixing his grey eyes, in which there was a look of strain uncomfortable to watch on his son, he muttered: "I'm getting on, Soames. At my age I can't tell. I might die any time. There'll be a lot of money. There's Rachel and Cicely got no children, and Val's out there, that chap his father will get hold of all he can, and somebody'll pick up Imogen, I shouldn't wonder." Soames listened vaguely. He had heard all this before. Whish, whish, went the brushes. "If that's all," said Emily. "All," cried James. "It's nothing. I'm coming to that." And again his eyes strained pitifully at Soames. "It's you, my boy," he said suddenly. "You ought to get a divorce." That word, from those of all lips, was almost too much for Soames' composure. His eyes reconcentrated themselves quickly on the button-hook, and, as if in apology, James hurried on. "I don't know what's become of her. They say she's abroad. Your Uncle Swithin used to admire her. He was a funny fellow." So he always alluded to his dead twin. The stout and the lean of it, they had been called. "She wouldn't be alone, I should say." And with that summing up of the effect of beauty on human nature, he was silent, watching his son with eyes doubting as a bird's. Soames too was silent. Whish, whish, went the brushes. "Come, James. Soames knows best. It's his business." "Ah!" said James, and the word came from deep down. "But there's all my money, and there's his. Who's it to go to? And when he dies the name goes out." Soames replaced the button-hook on the lace and pink silk of the dressing-table coverlet. "The name," said Emily. "There are all the other Forsytes." "As if that helped me," muttered James. "I shall be in my grave, and there'll be nobody, unless he marries again." "You're quite right," said Soames quietly. "I'm getting a divorce." James' eyes almost started from his head. "What?" he cried. "There! Nobody tells me anything." "Well," said Emily, "who would have imagined you wanted it? My dear boy, that is a surprise after all these years." "It'll be a scandal," muttered James, as if to himself, "but I can't help that. Don't brush so hard. When'll it come on?" "Before the long vacation. It's not defended." James's lips moved in secret calculation. I shan't live to see my grandson," he muttered. Emily ceased brushing. "Of course you will, James. Soames will be as quick as he can." There was a long silence, till James reached out his arm. "Here, let's have the eau de Cologne," and putting it to his nose, he moved his forehead in the direction of his son. Soames bent over and kissed that brow just where the hair began. A relaxing quiver passed over James's face, as though the wheels of anxiety within were running down. "I'll get to bed," he said. "I shan't want to see the papers when that comes. They're a morbid lot. I can't pay attention to them. I'm too old." Queerly affected, Soames went to the door. He heard his father say, "Here, I'm tired. I'll say a prayer in bed." And his mother answering, "That's right, James. It'll be ever so much more comfy." End of Part 3, Chapter 8. Recording by Leanne Howlett. Part 3, Chapter 9, of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 9, Out of the Web. On Forsyte changed the announcement of Jolly's death, among a batch of troopers, caused mixed sensation. Strange to read that Jolyon Forsyte, fifth of the name in direct descent, had died of disease in the service of his country, and not be able to feel it personally. It revived the old grudge against his father for having estranged himself. For such was still the prestige of old Jolyon that the other Forsytes could never quite feel, as might have been expected, that it was they who had cut off his descendants for irregularity. The news increased, of course, the interest and anxiety about Val. But then Val's name was Dartie, and even if he were killed in battle, or got the Victoria Cross, it would not be at all the same as if his name were Forsyte. Not even casualty or glory to the Haymans would be really satisfactory. Family pride felt defrauded. How the rumour arose, then, that "something very dreadful, my dear," was pending, no one, least of all Soames, could tell, secret as he kept everything. Possibly some eye had seen Forsyte versus Forsyte and Forsyte in the cause list, and had added it to Irene in Paris with a fair beard. Possibly some wall at Park Lane had ears. The fact remained that it was known, whispered among the old, discussed among the young, that family pride must soon receive a blow. Soames, paying one of his Sunday visits to Timothy's, paying it with the feeling that after the suit came on he would be paying no more, felt knowledge in the air as he came in. Nobody, of course, dared speak of it before him, but each of the 4 other Forsytes present held their breath, aware that nothing could prevent Aunt Juley from making them all uncomfortable. She looked so piteously at Soames, she checked herself on the point of speech so often, that Aunt Hester excused herself and said she must go and bathe Timothy's eye; he had a sty coming. Soames, impassive, slightly supercilious, did not stay long. He went out with a curse stifled behind his pale, just smiling lips. Fortunately for the peace of his mind, cruelly tortured by the coming scandal, he was kept busy day and night with plans for his retirement, for he had come to that grim conclusion. To go on seeing all those people who had known him as a long-headed chap, an astute adviser, after that, no. The fastidiousness and pride, which was so strangely, so inextricably blended in him with possessive obtuseness, revolted against the thought. He would retire, live privately, go on buying pictures, make a great name as a collector. After all, his heart was more in that than it had ever been in law. In pursuance of this now fixed resolve, he had to get ready to amalgamate his business with another firm without letting people know, for that would excite curiosity and make humiliation cast its shadow before. He had pitched on the firm of Cuthcott, Holliday and Kingson, two of whom were dead. The full name after the amalgamation would therefore be Cuthcott, Holliday, Kingson, Forsyte, Bastard and Forsyte. But after debate as to which of the dead still had any influence with the living, it was decided to reduce the title to Cuthcott, Kingson and Forsyte, of whom Kingson would be the active and Soames the sleeping partner. For leaving his name, prestige and clients behind him, Soames would receive considerable value. One night, as befitted a man who had arrived at so important a stage of his career, he made a calculation of what he was worth, and after writing off liberally for depreciation by the war, found his value to be some £130,000. At his father's death, which could not, alas, be delayed much longer, he must come into at least another £50,000, and his yearly expenditure at present just reached £2. Standing among his pictures, he saw before him a future full of bargains earned by the trained faculty of knowing better than other people. Selling what was about to decline, keeping what was still going up, and exercising judicious insight into future taste, he would make a unique collection, which at his death would pass to the nation under the title Forsyte Bequest. If the divorce went through, he had determined on his line with Madame Lamotte. She had, he knew, but one real ambition: to live on her renter in Paris near her grandchildren. He would buy the goodwill of the Restaurant Bretagne at a fancy price. Madame would live like a queen mother in Paris on the interest, invested as she would know how. Incidentally, Soames meant to put a capable manager in her place, and make the restaurant pay good interest on his money. There were great possibilities in Soho. On Annette he would promise to settle £15,000, whether designedly or not, precisely the sum old Jolyon had settled on that woman. A letter from Jolyon's solicitor to his own had disclosed the fact that "those two" were in Italy, and an opportunity had been duly given for noting that they had first stayed at a hotel in London. The matter was clear as daylight, and would be disposed of in half an hour or so, but during that half hour he, Soames, would go down to hell, and after that half hour all bearers of the Forsyte name would feel the bloom was off the rose. He had no illusions like Shakespeare that roses by any other name would smell as sweet. The name was a possession, a concrete, unstained piece of property, the value of which would be reduced some 20%, at least. Unless it were Roger, who had once refused to stand for Parliament, and, oh irony, Jolyon, hung on the line, there had never been a distinguished Forsyte. But that very lack of distinction was the name's greatest asset. It was a private name, intensely individual, and his own property. It had never been exploited for good or evil by intrusive report. He and each member of his family owned it wholly, sanely, secretly, without any more interference from the public than had been necessitated by their births, their marriages, their deaths. And during these weeks of waiting and preparing to drop the law, he conceived for that law a bitter distaste, so deeply did he resent its coming violation of his name, forced on him by the need he felt to perpetuate that name in a lawful manner. The monstrous injustice of the whole thing excited in him a perpetual suppressed fury. He had asked no better than to live in spotless domesticity, and now he must go into the witness box, after all these futile, barren years, and proclaim his failure to keep his wife, incur the pity, the amusement, the contempt of his kind. It was all upside down. She and that fellow ought to be the sufferers, and they were in Italy. In these weeks the law he had served so faithfully, looked on so reverently as the guardian of all property, seemed to him quite pitiful. What could be more insane than to tell a man that he owned his wife, and punish him when someone unlawfully took her away from him? Did the law not know that a man's name was to him the apple of his eye, that it was far harder to be regarded as cuckold than as seducer? He actually envied Jolyon the reputation of succeeding where he, Soames, had failed. The question of damages worried him too. He wanted to make that fellow suffer, but he remembered his cousin's words, "I shall be very happy," with the uneasy feeling that to claim damages would not make Jolyon, but himself, suffer. He felt uncannily that Jolyon would rather like to pay them, the chap was so loose. Besides, to claim damages was not the thing to do. The claim, indeed, had been made almost mechanically, and as the hour drew near, Soames saw in it just another dodge of this insensitive and topsy-turvy law to make him ridiculous, so that people might sneer and say, "Oh yes, he got quite a good price for her." And he gave instructions that his counsel should state that the money would be given to a home for fallen women. He was a long time hitting off exactly the right charity, but having pitched on it, he used to wake up in the night and think, "It won't do, too lurid, it'll draw attention. Something quieter, better taste." He did not care for dogs, or he would have named them, and it was in desperation, at last, for his knowledge of charities was limited, that he decided on the blind. That could not be inappropriate, and it would make the jury assess the damages high. A good many suits were dropping out of the list, which happened to be exceptionally thin that summer, so that his case would be reached before August. As the day drew nearer, Winifred was his only comfort. She showed the fellow feeling of one who had been through the mill, and was the femme sole in whom he confided, well knowing that she would not let Dartie into her confidence. That ruffian would be only too rejoiced. At the end of July, on the afternoon before the case, he went in to see her. They had not yet been able to leave town, because Dartie had already spent their summer holiday, and Winifred dare not go to her father for more money while he was waiting not to be told anything about this affair of Soames. Soames found her with a letter in her hand. "That from Val?" he asked gloomily. "What does he say?" "He says he's married," said Winifred. "Whom to, for goodness' sake?" Winifred looked up at him. "To Holly Forsyte, Jolyon's daughter." "What?" "He got leave and did it. I didn't even know he knew her. Awkward, isn't it?" Soames uttered a short laugh at that characteristic minimisation. "Awkward? Well, I don't suppose they'll hear about this till they come back. They'd better stay out there. That fellow will give her money." "But I want Val back," said Winifred almost piteously. "I miss him. He helps me to get on." "I know," murmured Soames. "How's Dartie behaving now?" "It might be worse, but it's always money. Would you like me to come down to the court to-morrow, Soames?" Soames stretched out his hand for hers. The gesture so betrayed the loneliness in him that she pressed it between her two. "Never mind, old boy. You'll feel ever so much better when it's all over." "I don't know what I've done," said Soames huskily. "I never have. It's all upside down. I was fond of her. I've always been." Winifred saw a drop of blood ooze out of his lip, and the sight stirred her profoundly. "Of course," she said, "it's been too bad of her all along. But what shall I do about this marriage of Val's, Soames? I don't know how to write to him, with this coming on. You've seen that child. Is she pretty?" "Yes, she's pretty," said Soames. "Dark. Ladylike enough." That doesn't sound so bad, thought Winifred. Jolyon had style. "It is a coil," she said. "What will father say?" "Mustn't be told," said Soames. "The war'll soon be over now. You'd better let Val take to farming out there." It was tantamount to saying that his nephew was lost. "I haven't told Monty," Winifred murmured desolately. The case was reached before noon next day, and was over in little more than half an hour. Soames, pale, spruce, sad-eyed in the witness box, had suffered so much beforehand that he took it all like one dead. The moment the decree nisi was pronounced, he left the courts of justice. 4 hours until he became public property. Solicitor's divorce suit! A surly, dogged anger replaced that dead feeling within him. Damn them all, he thought. I won't run away. I'll act as if nothing had happened. And in the sweltering heat of Fleet Street and Ludgate Hill, he walked all the way to his city club, lunched, and went back to his office. He worked there stolidly throughout the afternoon. On his way out, he saw that his clerks knew, and answered their involuntary glances with a look so sardonic that they were immediately withdrawn. In front of St. Paul's, he stopped to buy the most gentlemanly of the evening papers. Yes, there he was. Well-known solicitor's divorce. Cousin co-respondent. Damages given to the blind. So they had got that in. At every other face he thought, I wonder if you know. And suddenly he felt queer, as if something were racing round in his head. What was this? He was letting it get hold of him. He mustn't. He would be ill. He mustn't think. He would get down to the river and row about and fish. I'm not going to be laid up, he thought. It flashed across him that he had something of importance to do before he went out of town. Madame Lamotte. He must explain the law. Another 6 months before he was really free. Only he did not want to see Annette. And he passed his hand over the top of his head. It was very hot. He branched off through Covent Garden. On this sultry day of late July the garbage-tainted air of the old market offended him, and Soho seemed more than ever the disenchanted home of rapscallionism. Alone, the Restaurant Bretagne, neat, daintily painted, with its blue tubs and the dwarf trees therein, retained an aloof and Frenchified self-respect. It was the slack hour, and pale, trim waitresses were preparing the little tables for dinner. Soames went through into the private part. To his discomfiture, Annette answered his knock. She, too, looked pale and dragged down by the heat. "You are quite a stranger," she said languidly. Soames smiled. "I haven't wished to be. I've been busy." "Where's your mother, Annette? I've got some news for her." "Mother is not in." It seemed to Soames that she looked at him in a queer way. What did she know? How much had her mother told her? The worry of trying to make that out gave him an alarming feeling in the head. He gripped the edge of the table, and dizzily saw Annette come forward, her eyes clear with surprise. He shut his own and said, "It's all right. I have had a touch of the sun, I think." The sun. What he had was a touch of darkness. Annette's voice, French and composed, said, "Sit down. It will pass then." Her hand pressed his shoulder, and Soames sank into a chair. When the dark feeling dispersed, and he opened his eyes, she was looking down at him. What an inscrutable and odd expression for a girl of 20. "Do you feel better?" "It's nothing," said Soames. Instinct told him that to be feeble before her was not helping him. Age was enough handicap without that. Will power was his fortune with Annette. He had lost ground these latter months from indecision. He could not afford to lose any more. He got up and said, "I'll write to your mother. I'm going down to my river house for a long holiday. I want you both to come there presently and stay. It's just at its best. You will, won't you?" "It will be very nice." A pretty little roll of that R, but no enthusiasm. And rather sadly he added, "You're feeling the heat too, aren't you, Annette? It'll do you good to be on the river. Good night." Annette swayed forward. There was a sort of compunction in the movement. "Are you fit to go? Shall I give you some coffee?" "No," said Soames firmly. "Give me your hand." She held out her hand, and Soames raised it to his lips. When he looked up, her face wore again that strange expression. "I can't tell," he thought, as he went out, "but I mustn't think. I mustn't worry." But worry he did, walking toward Pall Mall. English, not of her religion, middle-aged, scarred as it were by domestic tragedy, what had he to give her? Only wealth, social position, leisure, admiration. It was much, but was it enough for a beautiful girl of 20? He felt so ignorant about Annette. He had, too, a curious fear of the French nature of her mother and herself. They knew so well what they wanted. They were almost Forsytes. They would never grasp a shadow and miss a substance. The tremendous effort it was to write a simple note to Madame Lamotte when he reached his club warned him still further that he was at the end of his tether. "My dear Madam," he said, "you will see by the enclosed newspaper cutting that I obtained my decree of divorce to-day. By the English law I shall not, however, be free to marry again till the decree is confirmed 6 months hence. In the meanwhile I have the honour to ask to be considered a formal suitor for the hand of your daughter. I shall write again in a few days, and beg you both to come and stay at my river house. I am, dear Madam, sincerely yours, Soames Forsyte." Having sealed and posted this letter, he went into the dining-room. 3 mouthfuls of soup convinced him that he could not eat, and causing a cab to be summoned, he drove to Paddington Station and took the first train to Reading. He reached his house just as the sun went down, and wandered out onto the lawn. The air was drenched with the scent of pinks and picotees and his flower borders. A stealing coolness came off the river. Rest, peace. Let a poor fellow rest. Let not worry and shame and anger chase like evil night-birds in his head. Like those doves perched half sleeping on their dovecot, like the furry creatures in the woods on the far side, and the simple folk in their cottages, like the trees and the river itself, whitening fast in twilight, like the darkening cornflower blue sky where stars were coming up. Let him cease from himself, and rest. End of Part 3, Chapter 9. Recording by Leanne Howlett. Part 3, Chapter 10 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 10, Passing of an Age. The marriage of Soames with Annette took place in Paris on the last day of January, 1901, with such privacy that not even Emily was told until it was accomplished. The day after the wedding he brought her to one of those quiet hotels in London where greater expense can be incurred for less result than anywhere else under heaven. Her beauty in the best Parisian frocks was giving him more satisfaction than if he had collected a perfect bit of china or a jewel of a picture. He looked forward to the moment when he would exhibit her in Park Lane, in Green Street, and at Timothy's. If someone had asked him in those days, "In confidence, are you in love with this girl?" he would have replied, "In love? What is love? If you mean do I feel to her as I did towards Irene in those old days when I first met her, and she would not have me? When I sighed and starved after her and couldn't rest a minute until she yielded? No. If you mean do I admire her youth and prettiness, do my senses ache a little when I see her moving about? Yes. Do I think she will keep me straight, make me a creditable wife, and a good mother for my children? Again, yes. What more do I need, and what more do 3/4 of the women who are married get from the men who marry them?" And if the inquirer had pursued his query, "And do you think it was fair to have tempted this girl to give herself to you for life unless you have really touched her heart?" he would have answered, "The French see these things differently from us. They look at marriage from the point of view of establishments and children, and from my own experience, I am not at all sure that theirs is not the sensible view. I shall not expect this time more than I can get or she can give. Years hence I shouldn't be surprised if I have trouble with her, but I shall be getting old. I shall have children by then. I shall shut my eyes. I have had my great passion. Hers is perhaps to come. I don't suppose it will be for me. I offer her a great deal, and I don't expect much in return, except children, or at least a son. But one thing I am sure of, she has very good sense." And if, insatiate, the inquirer had gone on, "You do not look, then, for spiritual union in this marriage?" Soames would have lifted his sideways smile and rejoined, "That's as it may be. If I get satisfaction for my senses, perpetuation of myself, good taste and good humour in the house, it is all I can expect at my age. I am not likely to be going out of my way towards any far-fetched sentimentalism." Whereon the inquirer must in good taste have ceased inquiry. The Queen was dead, and the air of the greatest city upon earth grey with unshed tears. Fur-coated and top-hatted, with Annette beside him in dark furs, Soames crossed Park Lane, on the morning of the funeral procession, to the rails in Hyde Park. Little moved though he ever was by public matters, this event, supremely symbolical, this summing up of a long, rich period, impressed his fancy. In '37, when she came to the throne, Superior Dosset was still building houses to make London hideous, and James, a stripling of 26, just laying the foundations of his practice in the law. Coaches still ran. Men wore stocks, shaved their upper lips, ate oysters out of barrels. Tigers swung behind cabriolets. Women said la and owned no property. There were manors in the land and pigsties for the poor. Unhappy devils were hanged for little crimes, and Dickens had but just begun to write. Well nigh 2 generations had slipped by, of steamboats, railways, telegraphs, bicycles, electric lights, telephones, and now these motor cars, of such accumulated wealth that 8% had become 3, and Forsytes were numbered by the thousand. Morals had changed. Manners had changed. Men had become monkeys twice removed. God had become Mammon. Mammon so respectable as to deceive himself. 64 years that favoured property and had made the upper middle class, buttressed, chiselled, polished it, till it was almost indistinguishable in manners, morals, speech, appearance, habit, and soul from the nobility. An epoch which had gilded individual liberty so that if a man had money, he was free in law and fact, and if he had not money, he was free in law and not in fact. An era which had canonized hypocrisy, so that to seem to be respectable was to be. A great age, whose transmuting influence nothing had escaped save the nature of man and the nature of the universe. And to witness the passing of this age, London, its pet and fancy, was pouring forth her citizens through every gate into Hyde Park, hub of Victorianism, happy hunting ground of Forsytes. Under the grey heavens, whose drizzle just kept off, the dark concourse gathered to see the show. The good old Queen, full of years and virtue, had emerged from her seclusion for the last time to make a London holiday. From Houndsditch, Acton, Ealing, Hampstead, Islington, and Bethnal Green, from Hackney, Hornsey, Leytonstone, Battersea, and Fulham, and from those green pastures where Forsytes flourish, Mayfair and Kensington, St. James and Belgravia, Bayswater and Chelsea and the Regent's Park, the people swarmed down on to the roads where death would presently pass with dusky pomp and pageantry. Never again would a queen reign so long, or people have a chance to see so much history buried for their money. A pity the war dragged on, and that the wreath of victory could not be laid upon her coffin. All else would be there to follow and commemorate. Soldiers, sailors, foreign princes, half-masted bunting, tolling bells, and above all the surging, great, dark-coated crowd, with perhaps a simple sadness here and there deep in hearts beneath black clothes put on by regulation. After all, more than a queen was going to her rest, a woman who had braved sorrow, lived well and wisely according to her lights. Out in the crowd against the railings, with his arm hooked in Annette's, Soames waited. Yes, the age was passing. What with this trade unionism and Labour fellows in the House of Commons, with continental fiction, and something in the general feel of everything, not to be expressed in words, things were very different. He recalled the crowd on Mafeking night, and George Forsyte saying, "They're all Socialists, they want our goods." Like James, Soames didn't know, he couldn't tell, with Edward on the throne. Things would never be as safe again as under good old Vicky. Convulsively he pressed his young wife's arm. There, at any rate, was something substantially his own, domestically certain again at last, something which made property worth while, a real thing once more. Pressed close against her and trying to ward others off, Soames was content. The crowd swayed round them, ate sandwiches and dropped crumbs. Boys who had climbed the plane trees chattered above like monkeys, through twigs and orange peel. It was past time, they should be coming soon. And suddenly, a little behind them to the left, he saw a tallish man with a soft hat and short grizzling beard, and a tallish woman in a little round fur cap and veil. Jolyon and Irene talking, smiling at each other, close together like Annette and himself. They had not seen him, and stealthily, with a very queer feeling in his heart, Soames watched those two. They looked happy. What had they come here for? Inherently illicit creatures, rebels from the Victorian ideal. What business had they in this crowd? Each of them twice exiled by morality, making a boast, as it were, of love and laxity. He watched them fascinated, admitting grudgingly, even with his arm thrust through Annette's, that she, Irene... No, he would not admit it, and he turned his eyes away. He would not see them and let the old bitterness, the old longing rise up within him. And then Annette turned to him and said, "Those two people, Soames, they know you, I am sure. Who are they?" Soames nosed sideways. "What people?" "There, you see them, just turning away. They know you." "No," Soames answered, "a mistake, my dear." "A lovely face, and how she walks. Elle est très distinguée." Soames looked then. Into his life, out of his life she had walked like that, swaying and erect, remote, unseizable, ever eluding the contact of his soul. He turned abruptly from that receding vision of the past. "You'd better attend," he said. "They're coming now." But while he stood, grasping her arm, seemingly intent on the head of the procession, he was quivering with a sense of always missing something, with instinctive regret that he had not got them both. Slow came the music and the march, till in silence the long line wound in through the park gate. He heard Annette whisper, "How sad it is, and beautiful," felt the clutch of her hand as she stood up on tiptoe, and the crowd's emotion gripped him. There it was, the bier of the Queen, coffin of the age slow passing, and as it went by there came a murmuring groan from all the long line of those who watched. A sound such as Soames had never heard, so unconscious, primitive, deep and wild, that neither he nor any knew whether they had joined in uttering it. Strange sound indeed, tribute of an age to its own death. Ah, ah! The hold on life had slipped. That which had seemed eternal was gone. The Queen. God bless her. It moved on with the bier, that travelling groan, as a fire moves on over grass in a thin line. It kept step and marched alongside, down the dense crowds, mile after mile. It was a human sound, and yet inhuman, pushed out by animal subconsciousness, by intimate knowledge of universal death and change. None of us can hold on forever. It left silence for a little, a very little time, till tongues began, eager to retrieve interest in the show. Soames lingered just long enough to gratify Annette, then took her out of the park to lunch at his father's in Park Lane. James had spent the morning gazing out of his bedroom window. The last show he would see, last of so many. So she was gone. Well, she was getting an old woman. Swithin and he had seen her crowned. Slim slip of a girl, not so old as Imogen. She had got very stout of late. Jolyon and he had seen her married to that German chap, her husband. He had turned out all right before he died, and left her with that son of his. And he remembered the many evenings he and his brothers and their cronies had wagged their heads over their wine and walnuts and that fellow in his salad days. And now he had come to the throne. They said he had steadied down. He didn't know, couldn't tell. He'd make the money fly still, he shouldn't wonder. What a lot of people out there. It didn't seem so very long since he and Swithin stood in the crowd outside Westminster Abbey when she was crowned, and Swithin had taken him to Cremorne afterwards. Rackety chap, Swithin. No, it didn't seem much longer ago than Jubilee year, when he had joined with Roger in renting a balcony in Piccadilly. Jolyon, Swithin, Roger, all gone, and he would be 90 in August. And there was Soames married again to a French girl. The French were a queer lot, but they made good mothers, he had heard. Things changed. They said this German Emperor was here for the funeral. His telegram to old Kruger had been in shocking taste. He should not be surprised if that chap made trouble some day. Change. Well, they must look after themselves when he was gone. He didn't know where he'd be. And now Emily had asked Dartie to lunch, with Winifred and Imogen, to meet Soames's wife. She was always doing something. And there was Irene living with that fellow Jolyon, they said. He'd marry her now, he supposed. My brother Jolyon, he thought. What would he have said to it all? And somehow the utter impossibility of knowing what his elder brother, once so looked up to, would have said, so worried James that he got up from his chair by the window and began slowly, feebly to pace the room. She was a pretty thing too, he thought. I was fond of her. Perhaps Soames didn't suit her. I don't know. I can't tell. We never had any trouble with our wives. Women had changed, everything had changed. And now the Queen was dead. Well, there it was. A movement in the crowd brought him to a standstill at the window, his nose touching the pane and whitening from the chill of it. They had got her as far as Hyde Park Corner. They were passing now. Why didn't Emily come up here where she could see, instead of fussing about lunch? He missed her at that moment. Missed her. Through the bare branches of the plane trees he could just see the procession, could see the hats coming off the people's heads. A lot of them would catch colds, he shouldn't wonder. A voice behind him said, "You've got a capital view here, James." "There you are," muttered James. "Why didn't you come before? You might have missed it." And he was silent, staring with all his might. "What's the noise?" he asked suddenly. "There's no noise," returned Emily. "What are you thinking of? They wouldn't cheer." "I can hear it." "Nonsense, James." No sound came through those double panes. What James heard was the groaning in his own heart at sight of his age passing. "Don't you ever tell me where I'm buried," he said suddenly. "I shan't want to know." And he turned from the window. There she went, the old Queen. She'd had a lot of anxiety. She'd be glad to be out of it, he should think. Emily took up the hairbrushes. "There'll be just time to brush your head," she said, "before they come. You must look your best, James." "Ah," muttered James, "they say she's pretty." The meeting with his new daughter-in-law took place in the dining-room. James was seated by the fire when she was brought in. He placed his hands on the arms of the chair and slowly raised himself. Stooping and immaculate in his frock-coat, thin as a line in Euclid, he received Annette's hand in his, and the anxious eyes of his furrowed face, which had lost its colour now, doubted above her. A little warmth came into them and into his cheeks, refracted from her bloom. "How are you?" he said. "You've been to see the Queen, I suppose. Did you have a good crossing?" In this way he greeted her from whom he hoped for a grandson of his name. Gazing at him, so old, thin, white, and spotless, Annette murmured something in French which James did not understand. "Yes, yes," he said, "you want your lunch, I expect. Soames, ring the bell. We won't wait for that chap Dartie." But just then they arrived. Dartie had refused to go out of his way to see "the old girl." With an early cocktail beside him, he had taken a squint from the smoking-room of the Lyceum, so that Winifred and Imogen had been obliged to come back from the Park to fetch him thence. His brown eyes rested on Annette with a stare of almost startled satisfaction. The second beauty that fellow Soames had picked up. What women could see in him! Well, she would play him the same trick as the other, no doubt. But in the meantime he was a lucky devil. And he brushed up his moustache, having in 9 months of Green Street domesticity regained almost all his flesh and his assurance. Despite the comfortable efforts of Emily, Winifred's composure, Imogen's inquiring friendliness, Dartie's showing off, and James' solicitude about her food, it was not, Soames felt, a successful lunch for his bride. He took her away very soon. "That Monsieur Dartie," said Annette in the cab. "Je n'aime pas ce type-là." "No, by George," said Soames. "Your sister is very amiable, and the girl is pretty. Your father is very old. I think your mother has trouble with him. I should not like to be her." Soames nodded at the shrewdness, the clear hard judgment in his young wife. But it disquieted him a little. The thought may have just flashed through him, too. When I'm 80, she'll be 55, having trouble with me. "There's just one other house of my relations I must take you to," he said. "You'll find it funny, but we must get it over, and then we'll dine and go to the theatre." In this way he prepared her for Timothy's. But Timothy's was different. They were delighted to see dear Soames after this long, long time. And so this was Annette. "You are so pretty, my dear. Almost too young and pretty for dear Soames, aren't you? But he's very attentive and careful. Such a good hush." Aunt Juley checked herself, and placed her lips just under each of Annette's eyes. She afterwards described them to Francie, who dropped in, as "cornflower blue, so pretty, I quite wanted to kiss them. I must say dear Soames is a perfect connoisseur. In her French way, and not so very French either, I think she's as pretty, though not so distinguished, not so alluring, as Irene." Because she was alluring, wasn't she, with that white skin and those dark eyes and that hair? Couleur de—what was it? I always forget. "Feuille morte," Francie prompted. "Of course, dead leaves. So strange. I remember when I was a girl, before we came to London, we had a foxhound puppy. To walk it was called then. It had a tan top to its head and a white chest and beautiful dark brown eyes, and it was a lady." "Yes, auntie," said Francie, "but I don't see the connection." "Oh," replied Aunt Juley, rather flustered, "it was so alluring, and her eyes and hair, you know." She was silent, as if surprised in some indelicacy. "Feuille morte," she added suddenly. "Hester, do remember that." Considerable debate took place between the two sisters whether Timothy should or should not be summoned to see Annette. "Oh, don't bother," said Soames. "But it's no trouble, only of course Annette's being French might upset him a little. He was so scared about Fashoda. I think perhaps we had better not run the risk, Hester. It's nice to have her all to ourselves, isn't it? And how are you, Soames? Have you quite got over your—" Hester interposed hurriedly. "What do you think of London, Annette?" Soames, disquieted, awaited the reply. It came, sensible, composed. "Oh, I know London. I have visited before." He had never ventured to speak to her on the subject of the restaurant. The French had different notions about gentility, and to shrink from connection with it might seem to her ridiculous. He had waited to be married before mentioning it, and now he wished he hadn't. "And what part do you know best?" said Aunt Juley. "Soho," said Annette simply. Soames snapped his jaw. "Soho?" repeated Aunt Juley. "Soho?" "That'll go round the family," thought Soames. "It's very French and interesting," he said. "Yes," murmured Aunt Juley, "your Uncle Roger had some houses there once. He was always having to turn the tenants out, I remember." Soames changed the subject to Maple Durham. "Of course," said Aunt Juley, "you will be going down there soon to settle in. We are all so looking forward to the time when Annette has a dear little—" "Juley," cried Aunt Hester desperately, "ring tea." Soames dared not wait for tea, and took Annette away. "I shouldn't mention Soho if I were you," he said in the cab. "It's rather a shady part of London, and you're altogether above that restaurant business now. I mean," he added, "I want you to know nice people, and the English are fearful snobs." Annette's clear eyes opened. A little smile came on her lips. "Yes?" she said. Thought Soames. That's meant for me. And he looked at her hard. She's got good business instincts, he thought. I must make her grasp it once for all. Look here, Annette. It's very simple, only it wants understanding. Our professional and leisured classes still think themselves a cut above our business classes, except, of course, the very rich. It may be stupid, but there it is, you see. It isn't advisable in England to let people know that you ran a restaurant, or kept a shop, or were in any kind of trade. It may have been extremely creditable, but it puts a sort of label on you. You don't have such a good time or meet such nice people. That's all. "I see," said Annette. "It is the same in France." "Oh," murmured Soames, at once relieved and taken aback. "Of course, class is everything, really." "Yes," said Annette, "comme vous êtes sage." "That's all right," thought Soames, watching her lips. "Only she's pretty cynical." His knowledge of French was not yet such as to make him grieve that she had not said tu. He slipped his arm round her, and murmured with an effort, "Et tu es ma belle femme." Annette went off into a little fit of laughter. "Oh, non," she said, "oh, non. Ne parlez pas français, Soames. What is that old lady, your aunt, looking forward to?" Soames bit his lip. "God knows," he said. "She's always saying something." But he knew better than God. End of Part 3, Chapter 10. Recording by Leanne Howlett.
Part 3, Chapter 11 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 11, Suspended Animation. The war dragged on. Nicholas had been heard to say that it would cost 300 millions if it cost a penny before they'd done with it. The income tax was seriously threatened. Still, there would be South Africa for their money, once and for all. And though the possessive instinct felt badly shaken at 3 o'clock in the morning, it recovered by breakfast time, with the recollection that one gets nothing in this world without paying for it. So, on the whole, people went about their business much as if there were no war. No concentration camps, no slippery de wet, no feeling on the continent, no anything unpleasant. Indeed, the attitude of the nation was typified by Timothy's map, whose animation was suspended, for Timothy no longer moved the flags, and they could not move themselves, not even backwards and forwards as they should have done. Suspended animation went further. It invaded Forsyte 'Change, and produced a general uncertainty as to what was going to happen next. The announcement in the marriage columns of the Times, "Jolyon Forsyte to Irene, only daughter of the late Professor Heron," had occasioned doubt whether Irene had been justly described, and yet, on the whole, relief was felt that she had not been entered as Irene, late the wife, or the divorced wife, of Soames Forsyte. Altogether, there had been a kind of sublimity from the first about the way the family had taken that affair. As James had phrased it, there it was, no use to fuss, nothing to be had out of admitting that it had been a nasty jar, in the phraseology of the day. But what would happen now that both Soames and Jolyon were married again? That was very intriguing. George was known to have laid Eustace 6-4 on a little Jolyon before a little Soames. George was so droll. It was rumoured, too, that he and Dartie had a bet as to whether James would attain the age of 90, though which of them had backed James no one knew. Early in May, Winifred came round to say that Val had been wounded in the leg by a spent bullet, and was to be discharged. His wife was nursing him. He would have a little limp, nothing to speak of. He wanted his grandfather to buy him a farm out there, where he could breed horses. Her father was giving Holly 800 a year,
so they could be quite comfortable, because his grandfather would give Val 5, he had said. But as to the farm, he didn't know, couldn't tell. He didn't want Val to go throwing away his money. "But you know," said Winifred, "he must do something." Aunt Hester thought that perhaps his dear grandfather was wise, because if he didn't buy a farm it couldn't turn out badly. "But Val loves horses," said Winifred. "It would be such an occupation for him." Aunt Juley thought that horses were very uncertain. Had not Montague found them so? "Val's different," said Winifred. "He takes after me." Aunt Juley was sure that dear Val was very clever. "I always remember," she added, "how he gave his bad penny to a beggar. His dear grandfather was so pleased. He thought it showed such presence of mind. I remember him saying that he ought to go into the Navy." Aunt Hester chimed in. Did not Winifred think that it was much better for the young people to be secure and not run any risk at their age? "Well," said Winifred, "if they were in London, perhaps. In London it's amusing to do nothing, but out there, of course, he'll simply get bored to death." Aunt Hester thought that it would be nice for him to work if he were quite sure not to lose by it. It was not as if they had no money. Timothy, of course, had done so well by retiring. Aunt Juley wanted to know what Montague had said. Winifred did not tell her, for Montague had merely remarked, "Wait till the old man dies." At this moment Francie was announced. Her eyes were brimming with a smile. "Well," she said, "what do you think of it?" "Of what, dear?" "In the Times this morning." "We haven't seen it. We always read it after dinner. Timothy has it till then." Francie rolled her eyes. "Do you think you ought to tell us?" said Aunt Juley. "What was it?" "Irene's had a son at Robin Hill." Aunt Juley drew in her breath. "But," she said, "they were only married in March." "Yes, Auntie, isn't it interesting?" "Well," said Winifred, "I'm glad. I was sorry for Jolyon losing his boy. It might have been Val." Aunt Juley seemed to go into a sort of dream. "I wonder," she murmured, "what dear Soames will think. He's so wanted to have a son himself. A little bird has always told me that." "Well," said Winifred, "he's going to, bar accidents." Gladness trickled out of Aunt Juley's eyes. "How delightful!" she said. "When?" "November." Such a lucky month! But she did wish it could be sooner. It was a long time for James to wait, at his age. To wait! They dreaded it for James, but they were used to it themselves. Indeed, it was their great distraction, to wait. For the Times to read, for one or other of their nieces or nephews to come in and cheer them up, for news of Nicholas's health, for that decision of Christopher's about going on the stage, for information concerning the mine of Mrs. MacAnder's nephew, for the doctor to come about Hester's inclination to wake up early in the morning, for books from the library which were always out, for Timothy to have a cold, for a nice quiet warm day, not too hot, when they could take a turn in Kensington Gardens. To wait, one on each side of the hearth in the drawing-room, for the clock between them to strike. Their thin, veined, knuckled hands plying knitting needles and crochet hooks, their hair ordered to stop, like Canute's waves, from any further advance in colour. To wait in their black silks or satins for the court to say that Hester might wear her dark green and Juley her darker maroon. To wait, slowly turning over and over in their old minds the little joys and sorrows, events and expectancies of their little family world, as cows chew patient cuds in a familiar field. And this new event was so well worth waiting for. Soames had always been their pet, with his tendency to give them pictures, and his almost weekly visits which they missed so much, and his need for their sympathy evoked by the wreck of his first marriage. This new event, the birth of an heir to Soames, was so important for him, and for his dear father too, that James might not have to die without some certainty about things. James did so dislike uncertainty, and, with Montague, of course, he could not feel really satisfied to leave no grandchildren but the young Darties, After all, one's own name did count. And as James's 90th birthday neared, they wondered what precautions he was taking. He would be the first of the Forsytes to reach that age, and set, as it were, a new standard in holding on to life. That was so important, they felt, at their ages, 87 and 85, that they did not want to think of themselves when they had Timothy, who was not yet 82, to think of. There was, of course, a better world. "In my Father's house are many mansions," was one of Aunt Juley's favourite sayings. It always comforted her with its suggestion of house property, which had made the fortune of dear Roger. The Bible was indeed a great resource, and on very fine Sundays there was church in the morning, and sometimes Juley would steal into Timothy's study when she was sure he was out, and just put an open New Testament casually among the books on his little table. He was a great reader, of course, having been a publisher. But she had noticed that Timothy was always cross at dinner afterwards, and Smither had told her more than once that she had picked books off the floor in doing the room. Still, with all that, they did feel that heaven could not be quite so cosy as the rooms in which they and Timothy had been waiting so long. Aunt Hester especially could not bear the thought of eviction. Any change, or rather the thought of a change, for there never was any, always upset her very much. Aunt Juley, who had more spirit, sometimes thought that it would be quite exciting. She had so enjoyed that visit to Brighton the year dear Susan died. But then Brighton one knew was nice, and it was so difficult to tell what heaven would be like. So on the whole she was more than content to wait. On the morning of James's birthday, August the 5th, they felt extraordinary animation, and little notes passed between them by the hand of Smither while they were having breakfast in their beds. Smither must go round and take their love and little presents, and find out how Mr. James was, and whether he had passed a good night with all the excitement. And on the way back, would Smither call in at Green Street? It was a little out of her way, but she could take the bus up Bond Street afterwards. It would be a nice little change for her. And ask dear Mrs. Dartie to be sure and look in before she went out of town. All this Smither did, an undeniable servant, trained many years ago under Aunt Ann to a perfection not now procurable. Mr. James, so Mrs. James said, had passed an excellent night. He sent his love. Mrs. James had said he was very funny, and had complained that he didn't know what all the fuss was about. Oh, and Mrs. Dartie sent her love, and she would come to tea. Aunts Juley and Hester, rather hurt that their presents had not received special mention, they forgot every year that James could not bear to receive presents, throwing away their money on him, as he always called it, were delighted. It showed that James was in good spirits, and that was so important for him. And they began to wait for Winifred. She came at 4, bringing Imogen and Maud, just back from school, and getting such a pretty girl too, so that it was extremely difficult to ask for news about Annette. Aunt Juley, however, summoned courage to inquire whether Winifred had heard anything, and if Soames was anxious. "Uncle Soames is always anxious, Auntie," interrupted Imogen. "He can't be happy now he's got it." The words struck familiarly on Aunt Juley's ears. Ah, yes, that funny drawing of George's, which had not been shown them. But what did Imogen mean? That her uncle had always wanted more than he could have? It was not at all nice to think like that. Imogen's voice rose clear and clipped. "Imagine, Annette's only 2 years older than me. It must be awful for her, married to Uncle Soames." Aunt Juley lifted her hands in horror. "My dear," she said, "you don't know what you're talking about. Your Uncle Soames is a match for anybody. He's a very clever man, and good-looking and wealthy, and most considerate and careful, and not at all old, considering everything." Imogen, turning her luscious glance from one to the other of the old dears, only smiled. "I hope," said Aunt Juley quite severely, "that you will marry as good a man." "I shan't marry a good man, Auntie," murmured Imogen. "They're dull." "If you go on like this," replied Aunt Juley, still very much upset, "you won't marry anybody. We'd better not pursue the subject." And turning to Winifred, she said, "How is Montague?" That evening, while they were waiting for dinner, she murmured. "I've told Smither to get up half a bottle of the sweet champagne, Hester. I think we ought to drink dear James's health, and the health of Soames's wife, only let's keep that quite secret. I'll just say like this, 'And you know, Hester,' and then we'll drink. It might upset Timothy."
"It's more likely to upset us," said Aunt Hester.
"But we must, I suppose, for such an occasion." "Yes," said Aunt Juley rapturously, "it is an occasion. Only fancy if he has a dear little boy to carry the family on. I do feel it so important now that Irene has had a son. Winifred says George is calling Jolyon the three-decker because of his three families. You know, George is droll. And fancy, Irene is living after all in the house Soames had built for them both. It does seem hard on dear Soames, and he's always been so regular." That night in bed, excited and a little flushed still by her glass of wine and the secrecy of the second toast, she lay with her prayer book open flat, and her eyes fixed on a ceiling yellowed by the light from her reading lamp. Young things, it was so nice for them all, and she would be so happy if she could see dear Soames happy. But of course he must be now, in spite of what Imogen had said. He would have all that he wanted, property and wife and children, and he would live to a green old age like his dear father, and forget all about Irene and that dreadful case, if only she herself could be here to buy his children their first rocking horse. Smither should choose it for her at the stores, nice and dappled. Ah, how Roger used to rock her until she fell off! Oh dear, that was a long time ago. It was. "In my Father's house are many mansions." A little scrattling noise caught her ear. But no mice, she thought mechanically. The noise increased. There, it was a mouse. How naughty of Smither to say there wasn't. It would be eating through the wainscot before they knew where they were, and they would have to have the builders in. They were such destructive things. And she lay with her eyes just moving, following in her mind that little scrattling sound, and waiting for sleep to release her from it. End of Part 3, Chapter 11.
Part 3, Chapter 12 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida. The Forsyte Saga, Volume 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part number 3, Chapter number 12. Birth of a Forsyte. Soames walked out of the garden door, crossed the lawn, stood on the path above the river, turned round and walked back to the garden door without having realized that he had moved. The sound of wheels crunching the drive convinced him that time had passed and the doctor gone. What exactly had he said? "This is the position, Mr. Forsyte. I can make pretty certain of her life if I operate, but the baby will be born dead. If I don't operate, the baby will most probably be born alive, but it is a great risk for the mother. A great risk. In either case, I don't think she can ever have another child. In her state, she obviously can't decide for herself, and we can't wait for her mother. It is for you to make the decision while I am getting what is necessary. I shall be back within the hour." The decision! What a decision! No time to get a specialist down. No time for anything. The sound of wheels died away, but Soames still stood intent. Then suddenly covering his ears, he walked back to the river. To come before its time like this, with no chance to foresee anything, not even to get her mother here. It was for her mother to make that decision, and she could not arrive from Paris till tonight. If only he could have understood the doctor's jargon, the medical niceties, so as to be sure he was weighing the chances properly. But they were Greek to him, like a legal problem to a layman. And yet he must decide. He brought his hand away from his brow wet, though the air was chilly. These sounds which came from her room, to go back there would only make it more difficult. He must become clear. On the one hand, life, nearly certain, of his young wife, death quite certain of his child, and no more children afterwards. On the other, death perhaps of his wife, nearly certain life for the child, and no more children afterwards. Which to choose? It had rained this last fortnight. The river was very full, and in the water collected round the little houseboat moored by his landing stage were many leaves from the woods above, brought off by a frost. Leaves fell, lives drifted down, death. To decide about death, and no one to give him a hand. Life was lost for good. Let nothing go that you could keep, for if it went, you could not get it back. It left you bare, like those trees when they lost their leaves, barer and barer, until you too withered and came down. And by a queer somersault of thought he seemed to see not Annette lying up there behind that window pane on which the sun was shining, but Irene lying in their bedroom in Montpellier Square, as it might conceivably have been her fate to lie 16 years ago. Would he have hesitated then? Not a moment. Operate, operate, make certain of her life. No decision, a mere instinctive cry for help, in spite of his knowledge even then that she did not love him. But this... Ah, there was nothing overmastering in his feeling for Annette. Many times these last months, especially since she had been growing frightened, he had wondered. She had a will of her own, was selfish in her French way, and yet so pretty. What would she wish? To take the risk? I know she wants the child, he thought. If it is born dead, and no more chance afterwards, it will upset her terribly. No more chance. All for nothing. Married life with her for years and years without a child. Nothing to steady her. She is too young. Nothing to look forward to for her, for me, for me. He struck his hands against his chest. Why couldn't he think without bringing himself in? Get out of himself and see what he ought to do. The thought hurt him, then lost edge, as if it had come in contact with a breastplate. Out of oneself? Impossible. Out into soundless, scentless, touchless, sightless space. The very idea was ghastly, futile. And touching there the bedrock of reality, the bottom of his Forsyte spirit, Soames rested for a moment. When one ceased, all ceased. It might go on, but there would be nothing in it. He looked at his watch. In half an hour the doctor would be back. He must decide. If against the operation and she died, how face her mother and the doctor afterwards? How face his own conscience? It was his child that she was having. If for the operation, then he condemned them both to childlessness. And for what else had he married her but to have a lawful heir? And his father at death's door, waiting for the news. It is cruel, he thought. I ought never to have such a thing to settle. It is cruel." He turned towards the house. Some deep, simple way of deciding. He took out a coin and put it back. If he spun it, he knew he would not abide by what came up. He went into the dining room, farthest away from that room whence the sounds issued. The doctor had said there was a chance. In here that chance seemed greater. The river did not flow, nor the leaves fall. A fire was burning. Soames unlocked the tantalus. He hardly ever touched spirits, but now he poured himself out some whisky and drank it neat, craving a faster flow of blood. That fellow Jolyon, he thought, he had children already. He has the woman I really loved, and now a son by her. And I am asked to destroy my only child. Annette can't die. It is not possible. She is strong. He was still standing sullenly at the sideboard when he heard the doctor's carriage and went out to him. He had to wait for him to come downstairs. "Well, doctor?" "The situation is the same. Have you decided?" "Yes," said Soames. "Don't operate." "Not? You understand, the risk is great." In Soames's set face nothing moved but the lips. "You said there was a chance." "A chance, yes, not much of one. You say the baby must be born dead if you do." "Yes." "Do you still think that in any case she can't have another?" "One can't be absolutely sure, but it is most unlikely." "She is strong," said Soames. "We will take the risk." The doctor looked at him very gravely. "It is on your shoulders," he said. "With my own wife I couldn't." Soames's chin jerked up as if someone had hit him. "Am I of any use up there?" he asked. "No, keep away." "I shall be in my picture gallery then, you know where." The doctor nodded and went upstairs. Soames continued to stand listening. By this time tomorrow, he thought, I may have her death on my hands. No, it was unfair, monstrous, to put it that way. Sullenness dropped on him again, and he went up to the gallery. He stood at the window. The wind was in the north. It was cold, clear, very blue sky, heavy, rugged white clouds chasing across. The river blew, too, through a screen of goldening trees. The woods, all rich with colour, glowing, burnished an early autumn. If it were his own life, would he be taking that risk? But she would take the risk of losing me, he thought, sooner than lose her child. She doesn't really love me. What could one expect? A girl, and French. The one thing really vital to them both, vital to their marriage and their futures, was a child. I have been through a lot for this, he thought. I will hold on, hold on. There is a chance of keeping both, a chance. One kept till things were taken. One naturally kept. He began walking round the gallery. He had made one purchase lately, which he knew was a fortune in itself, and he halted before it. A girl with dull gold hair, which looked like filaments of metal, gazing at a little golden monster she was holding in her hand. Even at this tortured moment he could just feel the extraordinary nature of the bargain he had made, admire the quality of the table, the floor, the chair, the girl's figure, the absorbed expression on her face, the dull gold filaments of her hair, the bright gold of the little monster. Collecting pictures, growing richer, richer. What use if... He turned his back abruptly on the picture and went to the window. Some of his doves had flown up from their perches round the dovecot, and were stretching their wings in the wind. In the clear, sharp sunlight their whiteness almost flashed. They flew far, making a flung-up hieroglyphic against the sky. Annette fed the doves. It was pretty to see her. They took it out of her hand. They knew she was matter-of-fact. A choking sensation came into his throat. She would not, could not die. She was too sensible. And she was strong, really strong, like her mother, in spite of her fair prettiness. It was already growing dark when at last he opened the door and stood listening. Not a sound. A milky twilight crept about the stairway and the landings below. He had turned back when a sound caught his ear. Peering down, he saw a black shape moving, and his heart stood still. What was it? Death? The shape of Death coming from her door? No, only a maid without cap or apron. She came to the foot of his flight of stairs and said breathlessly, "The doctor wants to see you, sir." He ran down. She stood flat against the wall to let him pass and said, "Oh, sir, it is over." "Over?" said Soames with a sort of menace. "What do you mean?" "It is born, sir." He dashed up the 4 steps in front of him and came suddenly on the doctor in the dim passage. The man was wiping his brow. "Well," he said, "quick. Both living. It is all right, I think." Soames stood quite still, covering his eyes. "I congratulate you," he heard the doctor say. It was touch and go. Soames let fall the hand which was covering his face. "Thanks," he said. "Thanks very much." "What is it?" "Daughter, luckily. A son would have killed her. The head." "A daughter." "The utmost care of both," he hears the doctor say, "and we shall do." "When does the mother come?" "Tonight between 9 and 10, I hope." "I will stay till then. Do you want to see them?" "Not now," said Soames, "before you go. I will have dinner sent up to you," and he went downstairs. Relief unspeakable, and yet a daughter. It seemed to him unfair to have taken that risk, to have been through this agony. And what agony for a daughter! He stood before the blazing fire of wood logs in the hall, touching it with his toe and trying to readjust himself. My father, he thought. A bitter disappointment, no disguising it. One never got all one wanted in this life, and there was no other. At least, if there was, it was no use. While he was standing there, a telegram was brought him. "Come up at once. Your father's sinking fast. Mother." He read it with a choking sensation. One would have thought he couldn't feel anything after these last hours, but he felt this. 7:30, a train from Reading at 9, and Madam's train, if she had caught it, came in at 8:40. He would meet that and go on. He ordered the carriage, ate some dinner mechanically, and went upstairs. The doctor came out to him. "They are sleeping." "I won't go in," said Soames with relief. "My father is dying. I have to go up. Is it all right?" The doctor's face expressed a kind of doubting admiration. If they were all as unemotional, he might have been saying, "Yes, I think you may go with an easy mind. You will be down soon?" "Tomorrow," said Soames. "Here is the address." The doctor seemed to hover on the verge of sympathy. "Good night," said Soames abruptly, and turned away. He put on his fur coat. death. It was a chilly business. He smoked a cigarette in the carriage, one of his rare cigarettes. The night was windy and flew on black wings. The carriage lights had to search out the way. His father, that old, old man. A comfortless night to die. The London train came in just as he reached the station, and Madame Lamotte, substantial, dark-clothed, very yellow in the lamplight, came towards the exit with a dressing bag. "This is all you have?" asked Soames. "But yes, I had not the time. How is my little one?" "Doing well, both. A girl." "A girl! What joy! I had a frightful crossing." Her black bulk, solid, unreduced by the frightful crossing, climbed into the brougham. "And you, mon cher?" "My father is dying," said Soames between his teeth. "I am going up. Give my love to Annette." "Tiens!" murmured Madame Lamotte. "Quel malheur!" Soames took his hat off and moved towards his train. "The French," he thought. End of Part 3, Chapter 12. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida. Part 3, Chapter 13 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick. Ponte Vedra, Florida. The Forsyte Saga, The Man of Property by Young Jolyon. Part 3, Chapter 13, James is Told. A simple cold coat in the room, with double windows where the air and the people who saw him were filtered, as it were, the room he had not left since the middle of September, and James was in deep waters. A little cold passing his little strength and flying quickly to his lungs. He mustn't catch cold, the doctor had declared, and he had gone and caught it. When he first felt it in his throat, he had said to his nurse, for he had one now, "There, I knew how it would be, airing the room like that." For a whole day he was highly nervous about himself, and went in advance of all precautions and remedies, drawing every breath with extreme care, and having his temperature taken every hour. Emily was not alarmed. But next morning, when she went in, the nurse whispered, "He won't have his temperature taken." Emily crossed to the side of the bed where he was lying, and said softly, "How do you feel, James?" holding the thermometer to his lips. James looked up at her. "What's the good of that?" he murmured huskily. "I don't want to know." Then she was alarmed. He breathed with difficulty. He looked terribly frail, white, with faint red discolorations. She had had trouble with him, goodness knew, but he was James, had been James for nearly 50 years. She could not remember or imagine life without James. James, behind all his fussiness, his pessimism, his crusty shell, deeply affectionate, really kind and generous to them all. All that day and the next he hardly uttered a word, but there was in his eyes a noticing of everything done for him, a look on his face which told her he was fighting, and she did not lose hope. His very stillness, the way he conserved every little scrap of energy, showed the tenacity with which he was fighting. It touched her deeply, and though her face was composed and comfortable in the sick room, tears ran down her cheeks when she was out of it. About tea-time on the third day she had just changed her dress, keeping her appearance so as not to alarm him, because he noticed everything. She saw a difference. "It is no use, I am tired," was written plainly across the white face, and when she went up to him he muttered, "Send for Soames." "Yes, James," she said comfortably. "All right, at once." And she kissed his forehead. A tear dropped there, and as she wiped it off, she saw that his eyes looked grateful. Much upset, and without hope now, she sent Soames the telegram. When he entered out of the black windy night, the big house was still as a grave. Warmson's broad face looked almost narrow. He took the fur coat with a sort of added care, saying, "Will you have a glass of wine, sir?" Soames shook his head, and his eyebrows made inquiry. Warmson's lips twitched. "He's asking for you, sir." And suddenly he blew his nose. "It is a long time, sir," he said, "that I have been with Mr. Forsyte. A long time." Soames left him folding the coat, and began to mount the stairs. This house, where he had been born and sheltered, had never seemed to him so warm and rich and cosy as during this last pilgrimage to his father's room. It was not his taste, but in its own substantial, Lincruster way it was the acme of comfort and security. And the night was so dark and windy, the grave so cold and lonely. He paused outside the door. No sound came from within. He turned the handle softly, and was in the room before he was perceived. The light was shaded. His mother and Winifred were sitting on the far side of the bed. The nurse was moving away from the near side, where was an empty chair. "For me," thought Soames. As he moved from the door, his mother and sister rose, but he signed with his hand, and they sat down again. He went up to the chair and stood looking at his father. James's breathing was as if strangled. His eyes were closed, and in Soames, looking on his father, so worn and white and wasted, listening to his strangled breathing, there rose a passionate vehemence of anger against nature, cruel, inexorable nature, kneeling on the chest of that wisp of a body, slowly pressing out the breath, pressing out the life of the being who was dearest to him in the world. His father, of all men, had lived a careful life, moderate, abstemious, and this was his reward, to have life slowly, painfully squeezed out of him. And without knowing that he spoke, he said, "It is cruel." He saw his mother cover her eyes, and Winifred bow her face towards the bed. Women! They put up with things so much better than men. He took a step nearer to his father. For 3 days James had not been shaved, and his lips and chin were covered with hair hardly more snowy than his forehead. It softened his face, gave it a queer look already not of this world. His eyes opened. Soames went quite close and bent over. The lips moved. "Here I am, father." What news? They never tell." The voice died, and the flood of emotion made Soames' face work so that he could not speak. Tell him? Yes, but what? He made a great effort, got his lips together, and said, "Good news, dear, good. Annette, a son." "Oh, It was the queerest sound, ugly, relieved, pitiful, triumphant, like the noise a baby makes getting what it wants. The eyes closed, and that strangled sound of breathing began again. Soames recoiled to the chair and stonily sat down. The lie he had told, based as it were on some deep temperamental instinct that after death James would not know the truth, had taken away all power of feeling for the moment. His arm brushed against something. It was his father's naked foot. In the struggle to breathe, he had pushed it out from under the clothes. Soames took it in his hand, a cold foot, light and thin, white, very cold. What use to put it back, to wrap up that which must be colder soon? He warmed it mechanically with his hand, listening to his father's laboured breathing, while the power of feeling rose again within him. A little sob, quickly smothered, came from Winifred, but his mother sat unmoving, with her eyes fixed on James. Soames signed to the nurse. "Where is the doctor?" he whispered. "He has been sent for. Can't you do anything to ease his breathing?" "Only an injection, and he can't stand it. The doctor said while he was fighting." "He is not fighting," whispered Soames. "He is being slowly smothered. It is awful." James stirred uneasily, as if he knew what they were saying. Soames rose and bent over him. James feebly moved his two hands, and Soames took them. "He wants to be pulled up," whispered the nurse. Soames pulled. He thought he pulled gently, but a look almost of anger passed over James's face. The nurse plumped the pillows. Soames laid the hands down, and bending over, kissed his father's forehead. As he was raising himself again, James's eyes bent on him a look which seemed to come from the very depths of what was left within. "I am done, my boy," it seemed to say. "Take care of them. Take care of yourself. Take care. I leave it all to you." "Yes, yes," Soames whispered. "Yes, yes." Behind him the nurse did he knew not what, for his father made a tiny movement of repulsion, as if resenting that interference. And almost at once his breathing eased away, became quiet. He lay very still. The strained expression on his face passed. A curious white tranquillity took its place. His eyelids quivered, rested. The whole face rested, at ease. Only by the faint puffing of his lips could they tell that he was breathing. Soames sank back on his chair, and fell to cherishing the foot again. He heard the nurse quietly crying over there by the fire. Curious that she, a stranger, should be the only one of them who cried. He heard the quiet lick and flutter of the fire flames. One more old Forsyte going to his long rest. Wonderful they were. Wonderful how he had held on. His mother and Winifred were leaning forward, hanging on the sight of James's lips. But Soames bent sideways over the feet, warming them both. They gave him comfort, colder and colder though they grew. Suddenly he started up. A sound, a dreadful sound, such as he had never heard, was coming from his father's lips, as if an outraged heart had broken with a long moan. What a strong heart to have uttered that farewell! It ceased. Soames looked into the face. No motion, no breath. Dead. He kissed the brow, turned round, and went out of the room. He ran upstairs to the bedroom, his old bedroom still kept for him, flung himself face down on the bed, and broke into sobs which he stilled with the pillow. A little later he went downstairs and passed into the room. James lay alone, wonderfully calm, free from shadow and anxiety, with the gravity on his ravaged face which underlies great age, the worn, fine gravity of old coins. Soames looked steadily at that face, at the fire, at all the room, with windows thrown open to the London night. "Good-bye," he whispered, and went out. End of chapter 13. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida.
Part 3, Chapter 14 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 14. His. He had much to see to that night and all next day. A telegram at breakfast reassured him about Annette, and he only caught the last train back to Reading, with Emily's kiss on his forehead, and in his ears her words, "I don't know what I should have done without you, my dear boy." He reached his house at midnight. The weather had changed, was mild again, as though, having finished its work and sent a Forsyte to his last account, it could relax. A second telegram, received at dinner time, had confirmed the good news of Annette, and instead of going in, Soames passed down through the garden in the moonlight to his houseboat. He could sleep there quite well. Bitterly tired, he lay down on the sofa in his fur coat and fell asleep. He woke soon after dawn and went on deck. He stood against the rail, looking west, where the river swept round in a wide curve under the woods. In Soames, appreciation of natural beauty was curiously like that of his farmer ancestors, a sense of grievance if it wasn't there, sharpened, no doubt, and civilised by his researches among landscape painting. But dawn has power to fertilise the most matter-of-fact vision, and he was stirred. It was another world from the river he knew, under that remote, cool light, a world into which man had not entered, an unreal world, like some strange shore sighted by discovery. Its colour was not the colour of convention, was hardly colour at all. Its shapes were brooding yet distinct, its silence stunning. It had no scent. Why it should move him he could not tell, unless it were that he felt so alone in it, bare of all relationship and all possessions. Into such a world his father might be voyaging, for all resemblance it had to the world he had left. And Soames took refuge from it in wondering what painter could have done it justice. The white-grey water was like the belly of a fish. Was it possible that this world on which he looked was all private property, except the water, and even that was tapped? No tree, no shrub, not a blade of grass, not a bird or beast, not even a fish that was not owned. And once on a time all this was jungle and marsh and water, and weird creatures roamed and sported without human cognizance to give them names.
Rotting luxuriance had rioted where those tall, carefully planted woods came down to the water, and marsh-misted reeds on that far side had covered all the pasture. Well, they had got it under, kennelled it all up, labelled it, and stowed it in lawyers' offices. And a good thing too. But once in a way, as now, the ghost of the past came out to haunt and brood and whisper to any human who chanced to be awake. Out of my unowned loneliness you all came. Into it some day you will all return. And Soames, who felt the chill and the eeriness of that world new to him and so very old, the world unowned, visiting the scene of its past, went down and made himself tea on a spirit lamp. When he had drunk it, he took out writing materials and wrote 2 paragraphs. On the 20th instant, at his residence in Park Lane, James Forsyte, in his 91st year. Funeral at noon on the 24th at Highgate. No flowers, by request. On the 20th instant, at the Shelter, Mapledurham, Annette, wife of Soames Forsyte, of a daughter. And underneath, on the blotting paper, he traced the word son. It was 8 o'clock in an ordinary autumn world when he went across to the house. Bushes across the river stood round and bright-coloured out of a milky haze. The wood smoke went up blue and straight, and his doves cooed, preening their feathers in the sunlight. He stole up to his dressing-room, bathed, shaved, put on fresh linen and dark clothes. Madame Lamotte was beginning her breakfast when he went down. She looked at his clothes, said, "Don't tell me," and pressed his hand. "Annette is pretty well, but the doctors say she can never have no more children. You knew that?" Soames nodded. "It's a pity. Mais la petite est adorable. Du café?" Soames got away from her as soon as he could. She offended him. Solid, matter-of-fact, quick, clear, French. He could not bear her vowels, her R's. He resented the way she had looked at him, as if it were his fault that Annette could never bear him a son. His fault. He even resented her cheap adoration of the daughter he had not yet seen. Curious how he jibbed away from the sight of his wife and child. One would have thought he must have rushed up at the first moment. On the contrary, he had a sort of physical shrinking from it, fastidious possessor that he was. He was afraid of what Annette was thinking of him, author of her agonies, afraid of the look of the baby, afraid of showing his disappointment with the present and the future. He spent an hour walking up and down the drawing-room before he could screw his courage up to mount the stairs and knock on the door of their room. Madame Lamotte opened it. "Ah, at last you come. Elle vous attend." She passed him, and Soames went in with his noiseless step, his jaw firmly set, his eyes furtive. Annette was very pale and very pretty lying there. The baby was hidden away somewhere, he could not see it. He went up to the bed, and with sudden emotion bent and kissed her forehead. "Here you are, Soames," she said. "I am not so bad now, but I suffered terribly, terribly. I am glad I cannot have any more. Oh, how I suffered!" Soames stood silent, stroking her hand. Words of endearment, of sympathy, absolutely would not come. The thought passed through him, an English girl wouldn't have said that. At this moment he knew with certainty that he would never be near to her in spirit, and in truth nor she to him. He had collected her, that was all. And Jolyon's words came rushing into his mind. "I should imagine you will be glad to have your neck out of Chancery." Well, he had got it out. Had he got it in again? "We must feed you up," he said. "You'll soon be strong." "But don't you want to see baby, Soames? She is asleep." "Of course," said Soames. "Very much." He passed round the foot of the bed to the other side and stood staring. For the first moment what he saw was much what he had expected to see—a baby. But as he stared, and the baby breathed and made little sleeping movements with its tiny features. It seemed to assume an individual shape, grew to be like a picture, a thing he would know again, not repulsive, strangely bud-like and touching. It had dark hair. He touched it with his finger. He wanted to see its eyes. They opened. They were dark. Whether blue or brown he could not tell. The eyes winked, stared. They had a sort of sleepy depth in them. And suddenly his heart felt queer, warm, as if elated. "Ma petite Fleur," Annette said softly. "Fleur," repeated Soames. "Fleur. We'll call her that." The sense of triumph and renewed possession swelled within him. By God, this thing was his. By God, this thing was his. End of Part 3, Chapter 14, and end of In Chancery, Part 2 of The Forsyte Saga, by John Galsworthy.